with George Stephanopoulos starts right now.
President Trump goes all in.
This guy's screaming, "We want Roy Moore." He's right.
Days before the special election, the president throwing his full support behind the controversial Alabama Senate candidate.
I think they're afraid that I'm going to take Alabama values to Washington. I can't wait.
As more Republicans walk back their earlier rejection.
It's a numbers game. I want Republicans to maintain control.
The race is tight. So what happens if Moore is elected? Will he face an ethics investigation and possible expulsion? Or will Republicans stand by him for the sake of passing their agenda? We're one-on-one with Moore's chief political strategist. And on Capitol Hill, lawmakers already taking action on sexual misconduct accusations.
We need to draw a line in the sand and say none of it is okay. None of it is acceptable.
Now, 3 days, 3 resignations. Is this just the beginning? And can this momentum translate into lasting change? Plus, violence after Trump's decision on Jerusalem. President Trump fulfilling a campaign promise and upending decades of U.S. foreign policy. So how does this move help Trump achieve what he's called the ultimate deal? Peace between Israelis and Palestinians. From the White House to your house, we take on the moments that mattered this week.
From ABC News, it's This Week, Here Now, co-anchor Martha Raddatz.
Good morning. After nearly 2 months of the Me Too tidal wave, Time magazine named the Silence Breakers, those voices that launched a movement, its Persons of the Year. And this week, the consequences of that movement finally came to Capitol Hill, now facing its own moment of reckoning. Congressman John Conyers, Representative Trent Franks, and Senator Al Franken all announcing their resignations this week over misconduct accusations. But as the Minnesota senator announced his departure Thursday, he took this parting shot.
There is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Franken referring to sexual assault allegations against President Trump and to Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, accused of sexual misconduct with minors. But in spite of those allegations, Moore has kept up his campaign, and he now has the full support of the president heading into Tuesday's election. All this testing the Me Too movement and the soul of the Republican Party.
Let me state once again, I do not know any of these women, did not date any of these women, and not engaged in any sexual misconduct with anyone.
Roy Moore accused of a range of inappropriate behaviors by 8 women, including Lee Korfman, who says Moore kissed her and touched her inappropriately when she was 14 and he was 32.
He touched me over my clothing, what was left of it, and he tried to get me to touch him as well.
And Beverly Young Nelson with her own account of an alleged assault when she was 16.
Mr. Moore reached over and began groping me and putting his hands on my breasts. I tried to open my car door to leave, but he reached over and he locked it so I could not get out.
The GOP establishment quickly condemned Moore and pulled its support.
I believe the women, yes.
If he cares about the values and the people he claims to care about, then he should step aside.
But despite the allegations, Moore refused to leave the race.
I'll quit standing when they lay me in that box and put me in the ground.
And just 12 days after those reports first surfaced, a lifeline from the White House.
I can tell you one thing for sure. We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat, Jones.
Then a week ago, the top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, also reopening the door.
Do you believe that Judge Moore should be in the Senate?
I'm going to let the people of Alabama make the call.
And by the middle of the week, Moore was back in the good graces of some Republicans, the RNC putting money behind Moore, and the president delivering a full endorsement of his candidacy.
How many people here are from the great state of Alabama? So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
And just yesterday, we learned Moore's campaign is set to run a robocall voiced by the president, his firmest step yet into the race. If this all sounds familiar, it's because it is. Last year's Access Hollywood tape that revealed Trump bragging about groping women threatened to derail the Trump campaign weeks before the election. But after an initial outcry, the GOP kept Trump as its nominee, and he marched on to that historic Election Day upset. So will Roy Moore follow the Trump playbook to victory on Tuesday night?
On December 12th, you'll see an election that the world won't forget.
So if Moore pulls out the win, will that saddle the GOP with the senator under a cloud of controversy heading into 2018? Joining me now from Alabama is Roy Moore's chief political strategist, Dean Young. Welcome to This Week. And let me go right to the first question. How much do you think President Trump's support will help Roy Moore, given that he had supported his primary opponent?
Well, President Trump's support is very, very important for the people of Alabama and this nation. You see, this is President Trump's agenda, and that's why it's so important that Judge Moore win this race. Last night we had Doug Jones, the liberal Democrat, with one of his Senate buddies, Cory Booker, who said that the president should resign. So this is Donald Trump on trial in Alabama. If the people of Alabama vote for this liberal Democrat, Doug Jones, then they're voting against the president who they put in office at the highest level. So it's very important for Donald Trump, and again, it's ground zero for President Donald Trump. If they can beat him, they can beat his agenda, because Judge Moore stands with Donald Trump and his agenda. Judge Moore wants the wall. Judge Moore wants to lower taxes. Judge Moore wants a military that's strong, and that's who Judge Moore is. And our opponent, this Democrat, Doug Jones, wants the exact opposite.
Well,
so it's very
we haven't
important
seen
to
Roy Moore.
President Trump.
We haven't seen Roy Moore out on the campaign trail much this week. Why is that?
Well, Judge Moore's been out for 25 years across Alabama, and he's known by the people of Alabama. He's talked to the people of Alabama, and they're with Judge Moore. And that's why I believe if we get our vote out, and we will, Judge Moore will be the senator that'll be going up to Washington on December the 12th and helping Donald Trump with his agenda.
You've said of the accusations against Judge Moore, I've known him and he's never, ever said anything derogatory or sexual toward any person, man, woman, ever. The kind of behavior he's accused of would not likely be in front of you or anyone else, would it?
Well, what he's been accused of is falling apart. You know, on Friday on one of your shows, the lady that Gloria Allred's client was trotted out there again to tell the world that, hey, I was misleading all of y'all. So it needs to be clear to the people of America, and especially the people of Alabama, that their stories are falling apart. That she told you one thing weeks ago, and now, right Friday, 2 days ago, she's coming out with Gloria Allred and the Gloria Allred circus and saying, well, you know, Judge Moore didn't write all this. I'm sorry about that.
Well,
so the people of Alabama need to know that.
Let's talk about that specifically, Mr. Young. You're talking about Beverly Young Nelson, who alleges Moore groped her and bruised her neck in the late 1970s when she was 16 years old. And as evidence of knowing him, she has been showing an inscription Moore made in her high school yearbook before the alleged assault. It reads, "To a sweeter, more beautiful girl, I could not say Merry Christmas. Christmas 1977, love Roy Moore." And Miss Nelson now says that she put in DA after that 122277 Old Hickory House, the restaurant where she says they were. She has acknowledged that she wrote that in there. But does that mean the rest of it is a forgery?
Well, let's just put it this way. Somebody's not telling the truth, and it's not Judge Moore. Everybody in Alabama has known Judge Moore's been telling the truth the whole time, and this is absolute proof that this woman went on TV, national TV, with Gloria Allred, of all people, somebody from California trying to influence the elections in Alabama, went on TV and told the whole world that Judge Moore wrote all of that. And now she's coming back 3 days before the election and saying, I'm wrong. He didn't write all of that. So somebody's not telling the truth, and it's not Judge Moore. We believe Judge Moore has been telling the truth the entire time, and this is just evidence that he's been telling the truth.
So where do you think this story came from? This original Washington Post story. You have 8 people talking about some sort of inappropriate behavior or flat-out assault. Do you think these women all just made it up? The women in the Washington Post story didn't even know each other.
Well, that's a good question, and the people of Alabama want to know why 30 days before an election that people would just come out of the woodwork and saying Judge Moore did this and Judge Moore did that. I'm not sure why they did it. I don't believe them, and the people of Alabama don't believe them. But I guess, one of them was in Time magazine. One of them was on your show on Friday. In this world where everybody wants to be on TV, maybe that's the reason. I'm not sure why.
Well, the most serious allegation is Lee Korfman. She claims Moore sexually assaulted her when she was 14 years old. She responded to Judge Moore's denial with this open letter. What you did to me when I was 14 years old should be revolting to every person of good morals. But now you're attacking my honesty and integrity. Where does your immorality end? Your smears and false denials and those of others who repeat and embellish them are defamatory and damaging to me and my family. I am telling the truth, and you should have the decency to admit it and apologize. So you are calling Lee Korfman a liar?
I'm saying Lee Korfman's not telling the truth. And what I'm saying is this, just like you just quoted her and said, we got to believe her because she said it, because she wrote it. That's what y'all said about the lady on Friday. Y'all said just because she said it. And by the way, she's got this piece of paper that she says Judge Moore wrote on in her yearbook. Y'all got to believe them. You got to believe them. Zero evidence. And this fake narrative about Judge Moore that the people of Alabama have been putting up with for 3 or 4 weeks is falling apart in front of y'all's eyes. And he will be the next senator from Alabama, and he will go up and help Trump. And this Democrat he's fighting is this Democrat's for asking Trump to resign. So the people of Alabama need to understand who they're dealing with.
I just want to say that your book, they have said that is evidence, and 30 other people backed up those 8 women in the Washington Post story. I want to ask you finally, if Judge Moore were to win the Senate seat, and the Senate initiated an ethics investigation, would Roy Moore go up there and testify under oath, disputing these allegations?
Well, Mitch McConnell and his crew have been threatening Judge Moore from the get-go. They spent $30 million down here trying to beat him in a primary. And then all this fake news from the Washington Post surfaces. Judge Moore's going to go to Washington. Judge Moore's going to win. And I highly doubt there's going to be a Senate investigation. But if there is, Judge Moore's going to be found telling the truth, just like he always has. And he will win. And the stakes couldn't be higher for Alabama. So Alabamians, you need to understand that Doug Jones and his bunch want our president to resign. Judge Moore wants to go up and help the president of the United States achieve his agenda to protect your gun rights, to build a wall, and to make America great again. And Judge Moore is the man that will do that. And I need you people in Alabama not to fall for all of these false allegations that just appeared 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Mr. Young.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me.
And let's bring in Representative Terry Sewell, the only Democrat in the Alabama congressional delegation. She'll be campaigning with Doug Jones later today. Congressman Sewell, I want to get your reaction first to Roy Moore's political strategist, Dean Young. He says Moore's accusers are liars. Your response?
Listen, the people of Alabama deserve a senator whose character and integrity and veracity won't be in question day one in the United States Senate. And we're working hard to make the case for Doug Jones. At the end of the day, they're putting party before people, party before principle. There's no reason to doubt these women. Independent corroboration, contemporaneous accounts, and 8 people who didn't know each other. At the end of the day, when Roy Moore, if he should win, goes to Washington, we will always be questioning his character. And I believe, and I know, that lawmakers, part of it is that we have to work together and across aisle in order to get things done. And there's only one candidate in this race who has earned the right to be the United States Senator, and that's Doug Jones. But Doug has been out here making the case.
I know he's been out there making the case, but these are very serious accusations against Roy Moore. Why is this race even close?
Listen, the state of Alabama voted for this president by 28 points. The fact that we are closed and narrowed in to a statistical dead heat is really important. I believe that the people of Alabama realize that this election is really about the soul of this nation and the soul of Alabama. And we who have been proud Alabamians know that we have been trying to overcome our painful past. And this candidate, Roy Moore, will only take us backwards and harken us back to the days of segregation, and Doug Jones will take us forward. I really believe that the people of Alabama understand what is at stake, and all the strategists can keep saying is that only Roy Moore will be behind this president's agenda. So they're putting, party over principle, party over the people. And I hope that the folks of Alabama, I really believe that the folks of Alabama will see through this and choose to vote for the right candidate over partisan politics.
And Congresswoman, I want to get your reaction to a mailer that the Jones campaign sent out to voters, which says, think if a black man went after high school girls, anyone would try to make him a senator. Many view that mailer as racially insensitive. One African-American voter told a local news outlet he no longer plans to vote after receiving the ad, saying for his campaign to put this flyer out, it is a complete slap in the face. You're the only African-American representing Alabama in Congress. Was that a mistake?
Listen, mailers don't vote. It's people who vote. And I really believe that the folks of Alabama will see through all of this nonsense about Roy Moore. At the end of the day,
but was
we
that
deserve
mailer
to have
a mistake?
senator.
Do you think that was a mistake? I know people vote and mailers don't, but was it a mistake?
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't think that the folks are concentrating on one piece of literature. I think that we have to look at the whole body of evidence and facts that Doug Jones has been, saying as to why he is the right candidate for the state of Alabama. So
and
I hope
those
that
facts,
we won't look at just one piece of literature.
One of those facts is Doug Jones' position on abortion. Let me read what he said in September. I am a firm believer that a woman should have the right to choose what happens to her own body. A Pew Research Center study in 2014 found that 58% of adults in Alabama say that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. So why should Alabama voters vote for Jones if they disagree with him on his stance on abortion?
Because we should not be voting on just one issue. We should look at the full body of issues, from health care to education to the economy. We need someone in Washington who will be an asset to the state of Alabama and help us bring industry to Alabama, and not a distraction, a national distraction and a national embarrassment. So I think at the end of the day, the folks of Alabama realize that it's not about one single issue. It really is about all the issues that matter to everyday Americans. We have a tax reform bill that's being called a tax reform bill that's about to go up for a vote that will not help middle-class Americans, that will not help Alabamians. It's a raw deal all the way around, and those are really, really important issues that are affecting everyday Americans every day.
Okay, thanks very much, Congresswoman Sewell. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Coming up, we'll get the view on the ground from voters in Alabama.
Roy Moore is not a miserable man. This man has more integrity than you can find in the entire Congress right now.
Plus, predictions about Tuesday's election from our Powerhouse Roundtable.
This week with George Stephanopoulos.
You blame her. She's 14.
I'm not blaming her. I'm blaming both of them. So I didn't say that I thought he was without sin. It's possible he did it, but it's possible that he could be forgiven for... I don't think he raped her.
And let's be real. It was a different world. 40 years ago in Alabama, people could get married at 13 and 14 years old. My grandmother at 13 was married. At 15, had 2 children and a husband and a job. If Roy Moore was guilty, if he was at the mall hitting on this 14-year-old, 40 years ago in Alabama, there's a lot of mamas and daddies that'd be thrilled that their 14-year-old was getting hit on by a district attorney.
That was Republican pollster Frank Luntz with a focus group of Republicans in Birmingham for Vice News Tonight on HBO. And we're going to go back now to Birmingham, Alabama. Check back in with Matt Murphy and Andrea Lindenberg. They're the hosts of Alabama's most listened to political news radio program, Matt and Ani, which is syndicated throughout the state. And Matt, let me start with you. You heard those comments from the focus group. Are those the kind of things you're hearing throughout the state?
No, Martha. I mean, since these allegations came out, I do believe that it caused Alabama voters concern. They did question some of the sourcing of some of the initial allegations, and they wanted to find out as close to the truth as we could get. Unfortunately, none of us are ever going to know what truly happened 38 years ago, but we have to weigh that against the political consequences of sending someone to Washington, D.C. that does not represent the Alabama values that voted for Donald Trump by a 2-to-1 margin.
And Andrea, this race, as you all know, has received an enormous amount of national attention. What effect has that had on it? You're talking about President Trump. You saw him come out for Roy Moore.
You know, and early on, Martha, we saw so many people in Washington, so many members of Congress saying Roy Moore should step down, we shouldn't vote for him. And so we in Alabama were saying, and the last time we talked with you, is let us as voters decide. And I've heard a shift in that. About a week and a half ago, you started hearing people like Mitch McConnell say, we're going to put this in the hands of the Alabama voters. I think that's encouraging. We've been asked a lot, did Donald Trump's endorsement help Roy Moore and the people voting for him? And I think we would agree on this, that those Roy Moore faithfuls, it didn't matter who endorsed him or did not endorse him. They're voting for him either way. I don't know how big of an impact it had on the people who said, I can't vote for Roy Moore or I'm staying home from the polls that day. I don't know that it moved the needle that much.
And Matt, you said when we spoke about 4 weeks ago that the voters of Alabama just needed more information from Roy Moore. You've touched on that a little bit, but basically all they've gotten is him denying it.
Well, and I do think it's concerning, Martha, that Judge Moore has made the decision not to speak directly in a sit-down way to some of the allegations. He's denied it, obviously, in a very confined way, but he's not answered questions about what his activities were, whether or not he did date girls who were of 17 or 18 years old. So I do think it's concerning that he's not spoken directly to some of these. He does send out a lot of folks like Dean Young, whom you had on the program a little bit earlier. So I think voters have to decide for themselves what they make of that. Perhaps it's that Judge Moore simply dismisses these allegations out of hand, or maybe he doesn't want to talk about, some of the things he was doing back in Gadsden in the 1970s and early 1980s.
And Matt, you have said you won't be voting in the election at all. Andrea, you said you might choose a write-in candidate. Are you hearing others say the same thing? And just talk about that a little bit, Andrea.
Yes, we are. We've heard people calling into our show. Most people say they are going to the polls. Now, historically, voter turnout has been pretty low in the state of Alabama. They're expecting maybe 25% of registered voters to actually be at the polls. But people are saying now who initially said, I don't want to vote for Roy Moore, they're looking more at party policy and on principle, too. We brought up abortion. That's certainly a factor in this. And many of our listeners have shifted to say, I will be voting for Roy Moore. We have two women who have alleged actual crimes have taken place, and one of them discredited herself a bit without telling the full story, and that's Beverly Nelson. So I think there are voters who, in the beginning when this broke, were hesitant and now have said, I'm voting for the Republican, and we'll deal with it the next election cycle if we don't think Roy Moore is the person who should be representing us.
And Judge Moore is not without controversy, Martha, and never has been. So he is a known figure to a lot of people in Alabama, and a lot of times we make some of these decisions based on some of that past history and not this present controversy.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt and Andrea. It's always great to see you. A busy week, so let's bring in the Powerhouse Roundtable. Jennifer Jacobs, White House reporter for Bloomberg News. Dan Balls, chief political correspondent for The Washington Post. Susan Glasser, Politico's chief international affairs columnist and host of the Global Politico podcast. And we welcome Joshua Johnson, host of NPR's 1A, based at WAMU here in Washington. Welcome, everybody. And Dan Balls, I'm going to start with you. It's all we've talked about all morning, and we're going to keep talking about it. Roy Moore, 2 days away. What do you think his chances are?
Well, I think his chances are probably pretty good. It's a very red state, and the degree to which tribal allegiance outweighs all of the other issues that have become so prominent in this election over the last few weeks, you would have to say he has some advantage. But he's obviously a flawed candidate. There's a real effort to try to turn out Democratic vote. We don't know how enthusiastic or unenthusiastic some of the Republican base might be. We know there's a lot of conflict and conflicted people there. You know, I'm not in the prediction business, but if Roy Moore, if everything goes according to pattern, Roy Moore probably has some advantage at this point.
And Jennifer, we saw President Trump campaigning about 20 miles from Alabama. He's going to do those robocalls today. Why didn't he just go into Alabama?
Well, listen, it's still really a controversial thing, even within the White House. Early on, some of his closest aides were advising him to keep his distance from this Roy Moore thing. They were saying, listen, we don't know what information is going to come out yet. We don't know how the Alabama voters are going to react or how the nation is going to react. The talking point should be, at this point, it's up to the voters of Alabama. And you had Mitch McConnell advising the president even to condemn Roy Moore. You had Chief of Staff John Kelly saying, let's just stay away from this at this point. And then you had other advisors who were saying, okay, go ahead and give a full-throated endorsement. But now
Which he has.
And now the race has stabilized somewhat. And you've got some advisors who are saying, this guy has great instincts. He's in touch with his base. He's right to come out and support Roy Moore. And then you have others in the White House who are still saying, we're uncomfortable with you cozying up to Roy Moore like this, and they've told him that.
And Joshua, Doug Jones, the Democrat in the Alabama race, is obviously reaching out to African-American voters. Have they done enough? Can he rally the vote?
That remains to be seen. I mean, the mailer that you mentioned with the Congresswoman from Alabama was right on the line. I mean, right down to the smirk on the guy's face, like, really? Do you think they wouldn't arrest me? It was right up to that line. But I don't even know if the African-American vote in Alabama is enough to carry Doug Jones over the line. It depends on how much African-Americans are mobilized by this, whether or not the mailer makes any difference, and whether or not they feel the same kind of fervor.
Any difference in getting them out, or any difference in them saying, I don't like that? Well,
both, really, but particularly in showing up. I mean, I feel like the evangelical Christians who are supporting Roy Moore have a very strong impetus to show up because of the platform that he's put forth. I'm almost more interested to see what happens with evangelical Christians, particularly with all the issues important to evangelicals that have come up in 2017, and whether this affects the way they view themselves, not only as voters, but as Christians.
I think you did a segment on that this week. What's your general feeling about that?
Well, this segment's coming out tomorrow, and I can't stop thinking about this verse from the book of Mark, chapter 8:36. What does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? And there have been a lot of issues important to evangelicals this year, from naming Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, or the Johnson Amendment, or, Roy Moore's candidacy, or Joel Osteen in Houston not opening Lakewood Church to victims of Hurricane Harvey, that are painting a picture of evangelicals as a key of President Trump's base. And I wonder at what point a reckoning comes, if any, where evangelical Christians say, we may be getting what we want in Congress, but is God pleased with our sacrifice? Is this who we want to be as a community of Americans whose primary purpose is to make more Christians? Is this who we are?
And Susan, you've obviously been watching this closely. President Trump says the last thing the Make America Great agenda needs is a liberal Democrat in the Senate. But if Roy Moore is elected, does he become a real headache for the Republicans and someone the Democrats will seize on?
Well, look, he's not going to be very welcome by his Republican Senate colleagues, never mind the Democratic Senate colleagues. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has made that very clear. I just want to go back to this point about President Trump. I do think, that he will own it. And crow about this as a great victory for his political program if Moore wins, that he's gone all in despite the advice of these advisors. You have Steve Bannon, who remains close to Trump, I think politically at least, out there campaigning directly for Roy Moore, inserting himself into the race in a way that suggests the fissure inside the Republican Party. That fissure will only grow wider if it comes up here to Capitol Hill. The Republicans are already suggesting there'll be a Senate investigation by the Ethics Committee. What on earth they're going to be able to determine from that, of course, is entirely unclear. It would be a big mess either way, as the great Dan Balls wrote in his column today. You have Alabama senior Republican senator, this is a deep red state, Richard Shelby, out this morning saying, that he would think that Alabama should do better than Roy Moore. That's quite unusual for a sitting senator of your same party to be attacking him.
And Dan, I just want to end with you quickly. Al Franken obviously resigned this week. Did that have to happen?
It seems in the current climate it did have to happen. I suspect over time there will be some revisiting of kind of what's the nature of the penalties that should be applied to different.
Kirsten Gillibrand said none of it is acceptable.
Right, and I think we are now in an environment in which that is the case. But the people of Alabama will render perhaps a different judgment on that question on Tuesday.
Okay, hang on for just a moment. The roundtable is sticking with us. We're going to take a look at the president's nearly 90-minute campaign rally Friday night. It was filled with red meat for Trump supporters. We'll hear from them and take a look at some of the president's questionable claims. We'll be right back. The fallout over President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital continues this morning as violent protests broke out in front of the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon. The issue is being used as a rallying call across the Muslim world, and more demonstrations are expected in the coming days. ABC's James Longman is on the ground in the thick of it with the very latest.
Overnight, across the region from Beirut to Jakarta, a rallying cry for angry protesters. And earlier, tear gas and rubber bullets raining down near the site where Jesus was born. This, not long after President Trump announced the US would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and vowed to move the US embassy there. At least 4 Palestinians have been killed and hundreds injured since the news broke. In Gaza, where fury at the president burned, Israeli airstrikes hit weapons sites after 3 rockets were fired into its territory.
He cannot give something that does not belong to him. There's no peace in the world if there is no peace in Jerusalem.
And on Friday at the United Nations, the US defending its decision.
The United States will not be lectured to by countries that lack any credibility when it comes to treating both Israelis and Palestinians fairly.
And James Longman joins us now. And James, I know you're there in the West Bank and behind you some protesters. What do you think we'll see in the coming days?
Well, Martha, more of the same. I don't know if you can see, but there have just been a huge volley of tear gas shot over from Israeli security forces as these groups of young men approach. And it's been like this here in Bethlehem, in Ramallah, across the West Bank, and in Gaza, and further afield across the Arab and Muslim world, because this really is a rallying cry. But we haven't seen the mass protest that I think some people expected. That might be because Palestinians feel a bit despondent about the situation with their leadership. But nevertheless, tensions here running very high, and violence can erupt at any moment.
And what's the reaction of the Israelis you've talked to?
Well, as you might imagine, the Israeli government is very supportive of this move. And speaking to people in West Jerusalem, for example, their reaction is very simple. They believe that Jerusalem is their capital. Their government buildings are here. The Knesset is here. So they think this is a realistic announcement to make. I don't think it's lost on Israelis, though, that Donald Trump made this speech to placate his base in the US because it was a campaign promise. But nevertheless, I think, broadly speaking, Israelis are happy, although I think people on the left of the Israeli spectrum here are slightly concerned that it might have a negative impact on negotiations.
And a little bit more on that. What do you think we'll see in terms of any kind of peace initiative?
Well, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas called the speech reprehensible. He said that this totally ruins the U.S. position as a neutral broker, if you like, because that goes to the very heart of this entire peace process. The United States has been a neutral broker to be able to get two sides around the table, and the Palestinian foreign minister has said very clearly that he believes that Donald Trump has picked a side. So there is going to need to be a peace process, a peace initiative, but quite what the role the United States has in that, well, I think that's now in the balance. Martha.
Thanks very much for joining us, James, and stay safe. And joining me now is the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. Good morning, Senator. I know you support President Trump's proclamation about Jerusalem. You just saw James Longman there talk about the peace process. You saw those demonstrations. How is this good for a peace process?
First, Martha, it's good to be with you. As has been pointed out, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. In 1995, Congress enacted a statute that said the same. So I think the announcement itself was not anything that is news. But what the president should have done is done it in the right diplomatic way. And there, I think he did not. It should have been done in a way to advance the peace process for a two-state solution. Instead, the president just made the announcement, did not take advantage of that in regards to the Israelis, and offered the Palestinians very little. I think that was a mistake, the manner in which he did it, but clearly, Jerusalem's the capital of Israel.
But he overturned basically decades and decades of U.S. foreign policy. Other presidents have said they want to do that, but he's the only one who has. So now what?
Well, I've talked to many of the players in the Middle East. I think they knew this day was coming. I don't think it was a surprise. I think what is the surprise is the manner in which the president did it, that he did not really engage all the players as far as trying to move forward on the peace process. A country determines its own capital. Israel determined that Jerusalem is its capital. It's where their government facilities are located. It is the facts. It's the facts on the ground.
I just want to say Turkey's president said it is like throwing the region into a ring of fire. Jordan's king said it will provoke Muslims and Christians alike. Saudis expressed concern. Even our European allies sounded a chorus of alarm, with French President Macron calling it regrettable, and others saying it will send us backward to even darker times than the ones we are already living in. So what would you say to them? You say you don't like the way President Trump did this. What do you do to fix it?
Well, Martha, we've seen this in so many places in the world where Mr. Trump has no appreciation for diplomacy. We see that in the budget he submitted with the State Department's budget. We see that on personnel decisions that are being made. I think the president is damaging America's national security and our standing in the world for his inability to use diplomacy in the right way. So there was a right way of doing this, and the president to date has not shown his understanding of the importance of diplomacy.
And I want to move back home here to Capitol Hill, to your colleague, Senator Franken, who resigned this week, said he was stepping down after more than 30 Democratic senators called for his resignation. You were not one of them. Why not?
Well, I let Senator Franken make his own decision. I think he did what he thought was best for the people of Minnesota. It was clear, as he pointed out on the Senate floor, that he could not defend himself and represent the people of Minnesota in the manner in which they were entitled. So he made his own decision, and I think it was the right decision. Moving forward, it's very clear that this type of behavior is just not appropriate. We now have a chance. I hope the people of Alabama will speak with a very clear voice that a person like Mr. Moore has no place in the United States Senate. The Republicans were speaking that language before the last couple of weeks, where now it looks like they're more concerned about having a vote in the Senate rather than who occupies that seat. So I hope the American people understand that this type of behavior will not be allowed.
And just quickly, if Roy Moore wins, do you think there should be an ethics investigation? Do you trust that process in Congress?
Well, clearly the Ethics Committee is the place in which we make our decisions as to qualifications for people staying in the Senate and for any penalties that may be imposed. I hope we don't have to reach that point, because I hope the people of Alabama on Tuesday will do the right thing and reject for Mr. Moore for what he stands for.
There's also a new Quinnipiac University poll out this week that found 70% of Americans say Congress should investigate sexual harassment accusations against President Trump. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's a limit as to what the Congress can do in investigating a president's conduct. Most of it falls under the impeachment clause. but there's clearly major concerns that have been expressed by many of us as to the behavior of President Trump, including the episodes involving the tapes that we've heard during the campaign. So there's clearly concerns that we have. The American people, of course, heard that and then elected him president of the United States. I think the important thing moving forward is to make sure that President Trump, that we have accountability for actions in office.
Thanks very much for joining us this morning, Senator.
Thank you.
I'll be right back with the roundtable in just 1 minute. And we are back now with our roundtable. And Susan, I want to turn to you just after listening to Senator Cardin. Is there any way to reignite any peace process such as it was before?
Well, look, there hasn't been a peace process, and I think, if anything, President Trump's promise to make the ultimate deal on peace certainly isn't going to happen any sooner as a result of this week's decision. In many ways, you know, the question is really, he charged his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, with making this deal. You know, the question is really whether
even though the vice president is now going over.
Well, exactly. Maybe he undercut his son-in-law in doing this. I think it lengthens the timetable, number one. Number two, you mentioned Vice President Pence is supposed to be going to the region this week. That will be an early test of just how bad the reaction is. For right now, it's not even clear that Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the head of the Palestinian Authority, will meet with the vice president. He might well cancel, I would imagine, as his protest against this. It underscores some important realities that Trump faces, obstacles to his ultimate deal. Number one, the United States has sort of pulled back in some ways from a leadership role. You see Vladimir Putin this week in the region, in Egypt. You see Emmanuel Macron, the French president, stepping in. And I think the message that they're trying to send is very clear, which is, if the United States isn't going to lead in the Middle East, we are, number one.
And others will step in.
Well, number two, and I think this is important for people here in the U.S. to understand, does Trump have anybody to make a deal with? The smartest Israel watchers that I know say, listen, I don't think that either Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the Israeli side or Mahmoud Abbas on the Palestinian side, it really has the political strength right now internally to be able to do something which is really tough, which is to make a breakthrough, to trade, to make concessions, the kind of deal that you need to make. And then on the American side, you have to look at this and wonder, how smart is Donald Trump being as a deal maker that he likes to portray himself as, to give away this concession without apparently gaining anything in return?
Even though he wants the ultimate deal. I want to move back to that speech in Pensacola. We saw that rally. We heard what he said about Roy Moore. But let's play one of the president's biggest applause lines from the evening.
My job is not to be president of the world. My job is to be president of the United States of America. Yet there are powerful forces in Washington trying to sabotage our movement. These are bad people. These are very, very bad and evil people. They will lie and leak and smear because they don't want to accept the results of an election where we won by a landslide.
So, Jennifer, why is he still on that topic?
So the White House said that they wanted to test some of the themes for 2018 at this rally. So you noticed that some of the biggest applause lines were when Trump talked about the fake news. He likes to stress the idea
he likes that one.
That the media is part of the left and the propaganda of the left. The biggest cheers were at the mention of the national anthem and Trump's demand that Americans should stand during the anthem. Any mention of the military. Those were the biggest applause lines, according to my coworker who was in the room. You'll notice he did stay away from some of the more inflammatory race-based racial relations comments that he's made in the past, such as both sides from Charlottesville and things like that.
And Dan, what was your reaction to the entire speech?
Well, I thought it was a classic Donald Trump campaign rally speech of the kind that we saw throughout 2016 and that we've seen when he's gone out into the country during his presidency. He feeds off those crowds. He tests lines when he's out in an audience like that. And as we know, he exaggerates mightily on things. I mean, I was struck again when he talked about winning in a landslide. He did lose the popular vote. He clearly won the Electoral College, but his Electoral College numbers were well below those of Presidents Reagan, President Clinton, President George H.W. Bush, etc. So he has this desire to feed his base, and he does it extraordinarily well when he's out in front of them, but he leaves himself open to all these other questions.
But he did have some positive news on the economy, on jobs.
There was positive news. And, you know, the jobless rate has remained at 4.1%. We added jobs last month. The Dow Jones hit another record, so that is good news. But basically, this is kind of a version of the speech the president always gives. So I wasn't really shocked. I mean, I keep going back to that Maya Angelou quote, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. This is kind of a version of the kind of speech that we know the president likes to give because he's among his base. It's comfortable territory.
And I want to interrupt you quickly. We only just have a few seconds here. But the New York Times story talking about what's going on inside the White House. Has the presidency changed Donald Trump, or has Donald Trump changed the presidency?
Yes. And it's also changed the body politic. I mean, you can't go into the White House without being changed. I will be interested to see how steadfastly Donald Trump is able to remain the same person in 2020 that he was in 2016 and convince his base to keep him in that position. That's the real question.
And just very quickly on that story as well, John Kelly still have a lot of influence in the White House. It says that Donald Trump craves the attention.
Yes, he tries to be subtle, though. He tries to do it in a way that the president doesn't feel like he's being micromanaged.
Okay, thanks all of you. It's always good to see you on a Sunday morning. That's all we have for today. Thanks for sharing part of your Sunday with us. Check out World News Tonight and have a great day.
As the capital of Israel sparks violent protests in the Middle East, plus forced resignations over sexual misconduct rattle Congress as work begins to clean up a messy tax bill in the rush to get it to the president's desk by Christmas. There is fury in the Arab world today and concern for American citizens' safety overseas, as criticism from U.S. allies over the administration's plan to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem threatens to further deteriorate the view of the U.S. role around the world. We'll talk to UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. Back at home, members of Congress pushed 3 of their colleagues accused of sexual misconduct out. But with 2 days until the Senate special election in Alabama, will accused child molester Roy Moore be in?
I did not date underage women. I did not molest anyone. Right. And so these allegations are false.
Democrats are hoping Doug Jones can turn out the African-American vote and are attacking Moore's character.
Think about it. Has Roy Moore ever looked you in the eye and told you the truth?
Senate Republicans still refuse to support Moore, but the president is all in, campaigning near Alabama and recording a robocall on Moore's behalf.
So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
We'll talk to Maine's Republican Senator Susan Collins and the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, Illinois' Richard Durbin, about the politics of sexual misconduct in Congress and efforts to clean up a sprawling tax bill that has sparked more questions than answers. We'll also have plenty of analysis, both foreign and domestic, on all the news this week. It's just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. We want to begin with a look at the reaction to the president's decision on Jerusalem. CBS News correspondent Seth Doan reports.
This is the entrance to the old city of Jerusalem. Damascus Gate has historically been a flashpoint for violence. It is calm today, but additional security is in place. And there is a worrying development this morning. Unrest is pushing beyond Israel's borders. In Lebanon today, security forces fired tear gas and used a water cannon to push back pro-Palestinian protesters in front of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. Those demonstrators threw objects and lit fires to register their anger over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In Cairo, there was serious diplomatic blowback at an emergency meeting of Arab League foreign ministers who criticized Mr. Trump's decision, saying it threatens to push the region to the edge of the abyss of violence, chaos, and bloodshed. After days of clashes, protests continue, while funerals for some of those killed in Gaza revealed a dangerous mix of anger and grief. Israel's military announced today it destroyed what it called a significant terrorist tunnel. In the past, Hamas has used tunnels to move weapons, supplies, and to carry out surprise attacks. Today, the military wing of Hamas made an ominous statement saying that the next few days would prove to the world what a mistake the U.S. decision had been, and warned not to underestimate the will of the Palestinian resistance.
We turn now to UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. She joins us from New York. Welcome, Madam Ambassador. I want to start where you've seen the violence in response to the U.S. decision on the embassy. There's a lot of tension in the Middle East with all that's going on and all that the U.S. has to deal with there. Why was this a priority and in America's national interest to make this move right now?
Good morning, John. Well, first of all, this is a move the American people have asked for 22 years. And 6 months ago, the Senate overwhelmingly again asked for the embassy to be moved. And I think you have to look at the fact that every presidential candidate, Republican or Democrat, has all said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and the embassy should be moved. President Trump's the only one that had the courage to actually do that. And so what this does is basically do what we do in almost every other country, which is put the embassy in the capital city. And Jerusalem is where the prime minister is, the president is, the parliament, the Supreme Court. It makes sense for our embassy to be there.
Given all that's happening in the world, why is it a priority to do this right now? And why is it worth paying the price of the increased violence?
Because it's the right thing to do. It is absolutely the right thing to do. And look, for the last 22 years, everyone around every president has said, just wait, just wait, just wait. And President Trump's not going to wait anymore.
But explain why it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do because it's just reality. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. They have said that. When the American people say they want something, it's their will that we're supposed to follow.
But in this case, the U.S. is, critics believe, changing its role. It's stepping in more forcefully on the side of Israel, and that sends a signal that is not going to make things better. So explain how we get from this move to a better outcome. And whether all this violence isn't going to delay a better outcome.
Well, first of all, I think that when you recognize the truth, when both parties recognize reality, peace comes. And that's just the true reality of the situation. We are living in the reality that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. But if you notice when the president spoke, he made it very clear. He didn't talk about boundaries. He didn't talk about borders. He didn't get into any of that because the final status of Jerusalem is between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's not for the Americans to decide. So we are doing what we do in every other country. Israel should be no different. And then we're going to continue to support the peace process. You know, courage breeds leadership. What you saw was a courageous move by the president. And of course, anytime you have to use courage, anytime you have to go against the status quo, you're going to have people saying the sky is falling. But the sky is not falling. If anything, what we're going to see is both sides are going to come to the table. They're going to decide what they think Jerusalem should look like, and we're going to support that process.
Of course, the rebuttal would be that aggressive moves in the Middle East have often cost the United States a lot in blood and treasure. Let me ask you this question on a negotiating standpoint. One of the criticisms is the president gave up a bargaining chip that could be used in negotiation. Another view is the president has now given the Israelis something, and now he can ask something from them in return. Which of those two do you subscribe to?
So neither one of those is right. The president took Jerusalem off the table. That's what he did, because that's something that we have always, people have said, use that as a bargaining chip. Let's be clear. The last 22 years, that was a bargaining chip, and it got us nowhere closer to peace. What he did was take it off the table. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Take that off the table, tell both sides to come together and say, okay, you decide how you want to split up Jerusalem. You decide if you're going to create boundaries or borders there, and let them decide. There are going to be naysayers, John, that say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. But they also questioned the president when he first decided to strike for chemical weapons in Syria, and that was true leadership. They said the same thing when we started to push North Korea and push sanctions. That was true leadership. This, again, will go down in history to show he made the move that finally got the two parties to come to the table. And it's okay for naysayers, but we know at the end of the day this was the right thing to do.
Let me ask you about North Korea. Lindsey Graham, a South Carolina senator, said the U.S. should start moving civilians out of South Korea. What's your response to that?
Well, I think we're watching North Korea very carefully. And, you know, if you look at the last ballistic missile launch, it had advanced quite a bit compared to the missile before, and it's a concern. And what we will tell you is North Korea is the biggest threat we have right now, but we're not going to let that stop us. We're going to continue to be forceful. We're going to continue to have the international community join us as they have, and we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to denuclearize North Korea.
Let me ask you about a domestic issue here. There's a cultural shift going on in America right now. You saw it. 3 members of Congress kicked out of Congress because of sexual behavior, misdeeds. You were the first woman senator of South Carolina. What do you think of this cultural moment that's happening?
I am incredibly proud of the women who have come forward. I'm proud of their strength. I'm proud of their courage. And I think that the idea that this is happening, I think it will start to bring a conscience to the situation, not just in politics, but in, we've seen in Hollywood and in every industry. And I think the time has come.
Of course, I'm wrong. You were the first governor of South Carolina. Given that consciousness, how do you think people should assess the accusers of the president?
Well, I mean, the same thing as women who accuse anyone should be heard. They should be heard and they should be dealt with. And I think we heard from them prior to the election. And I think any woman who has felt violated or felt mistreated in any way, they have every right to speak up.
And does the election mean that's a settled issue?
That's for the people to decide. I know that he was elected, but, women should always feel comfortable coming forward, and we should all be willing to listen to them.
Ambassador Nikki Haley, thanks so much for being with us.
Okay, thanks, John.
And we want to turn now to Maine's Republican Senator Susan Collins. Welcome, Senator. We have some important tax business to get to, but I want to stay with this question of the revolution that's going on in the way that sexual assault is being dealt with. This week, the Republican National Committee supported Roy Moore. You do not support him. You say you believe his accusers. Your colleague, Republican Ben Sass, wrote this: "I believe the women, and the RNC previously did too. What's changed? Or is the party just indifferent? You're a Republican. What do you think about the RNC supporting Roy Moore?"
I'm disappointed that the RNC has resumed its support of Roy Moore. I think that's a mistake. I would point out that I did not support Mr. Moore even prior to these allegations of sexual misconduct, because I was concerned about his anti-Muslim comments, his anti-LGBT comments, and also, most important of all, he'd been removed twice from the Alabama Supreme Court for failure to follow lawful judicial orders.
You also, with the news about Al Franken this week, you called for him to resign. Are you closer to the Democratic Party on these issues than you are the Republican Party?
I think Republicans care just as much as Democrats about sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. There's a new awakening in our country that this is pervasive, whether we're talking about Hollywood or Wall Street or the media or Capitol Hill. And that's why I'm joining a bipartisan group of senators who are trying to look at our own procedures on Capitol Hill to assure that allegations of sexual misconduct involving members or staff are dealt with seriously.
Last question on this before taxes. On the question of procedures, the Senate might have a decision to make with Roy Moore if he's elected. Here's something I'm trying to work through. With the president, there were these accusations. They were adjudicated in the election, the White House says. So the voters knew about them and they voted for him, and now he's president. Why wouldn't that same standard apply to Roy Moore? The voters of Alabama know exactly what has been alleged. If he gets elected, what business does the Senate have telling the voters they're wrong?
Well, I think that's the tough question. If the allegations are known prior to the election, which they weren't in the case of Al Franken, for example, then we have a very tough decision to make about whether it's our role as senators to overturn the will of the people. Now, I think it's a different situation if the allegations are not known or if they occur while the person is sitting in the Senate.
Right. Let me go on to taxes. You voted for the Senate tax cut bill. but you seem to be having questions about this conference report. Where are you on things now?
I always wait until the final version of the bill is brought before us before I make a final decision on whether or not to support it. There are major differences between the House and Senate bills, and I don't know where the bill is going to come out. I also obviously care very much about amendments that I was successful in getting in the bill that particularly help middle-income families, and I'm also concerned about agreements that I have.
Let me ask you about two of those agreements. One is on Medicare. You got an agreement from Leader McConnell and Paul Ryan that there would not be these automatic Medicare cuts afterwards. Paul Ryan seemed to suggest maybe he wasn't a party to that agreement. What's the nature? Where do things stand on that agreement?
I have written correspondence that memorializes the agreement that the 4% cut in Medicare that could go into effect will not go into effect. I would point out that that law has been waived 16 times. It has never been implemented, but I don't want seniors to have the anxiety of wondering whether the tax bill somehow is going to trigger a cut in Medicare. I'm absolutely confident. I have it in writing, a statement by both Mitch McConnell and Speaker Ryan.
The waiving of the so-called pay-go rules. Let me ask you about seniors and seniors in Maine. The other thing you got a commitment on, as I understand it, is that there would be legislation that would come up before the end of the year dealing with these cost-sharing payments. There's a piece of legislation sponsored by Alexander and Murray. What's happening with that? Because in the House, Republicans are being told, nah, that's not going to be a part of anything before the end of the year, which means without those cost-sharing payments, premiums are going up for Maine seniors.
I've had a lot of conversations, not only with my colleagues in the Senate, but with my colleagues on the House side and with the White House. I've talked to the president 3 times about this issue. And once again, I have no reason to believe that that commitment will not be kept. After all, who wants to see health insurance premiums become more unaffordable than they already are for individuals who are buying insurance in the individual market? And our 2 bills, there's one that I have with Bill Nelson and the Alexander Murray bill, will exert downward pressure on premiums and make it more affordable.
There is one critique of that, though, that your legislation helped the condition before this tax bill, which has the removal of that individual mandate, and that basically these fixes won't be enough for those people who will see higher premium increases.
We have a brand new study that just came out last week by Avalier, a respected consulting firm, that says it will more than offset the repeal of the individual mandate. And keep in mind that the individual mandate fines fall disproportionately on low and middle income families. 80% of those fines are paid by families who make less than $50,000 a year.
All right, Senator, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
And we'll be back in 1 minute to hear from the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, Richard Durbin. Joining us now is Senate Democratic Whip Richard Durbin. He is in Springfield, Illinois. Welcome, Senator. I want to pick up on something that Senator Collins said about the choice that senators may face if Roy Moore is elected in Alabama. And the question is, what business does the Senate have in overturning the will of the people of Alabama if he's elected? Senator Collins says that's a very tough decision. What's your sense of it?
Well, John, I can tell you this. First, the decision is to be made by the voters in Alabama on Tuesday. And I hope that they will do the right thing in terms of defining their standards and values when it comes to the people representing them in Washington. But we have heard from Republican senators first who have suggested that if Roy Moore ends up being elected to the Senate, he would face close scrutiny, investigation, even removal from the Senate once he arrives. I agree with Senator Collins. It's a complicated issue. But I will tell you this. We faced the reality this past week. I've known Al Franken for over 20 years. He is my friend. He was on the floor of the Senate announcing his resignation. I sat just a few feet away from him. He said it was the worst day in his political life. It was a somber feeling. It was a reality. And I hope the voters of Alabama appreciate that reality when they make their decision on Tuesday.
Let me ask you about a political critique of the Democratic Party's pressure on Al Franken that led to his resignation. Dahlia Lithwick writes in Slate a piece that says, morality is no longer its own reward. What we get in exchange for being good and morally right is now nothing. The argument that the Democrats have a standard that leads Franken to go and the Republicans the Republican committee supporting more, the president's supporting more, and that essentially Democrats are on the high road, but it's a politically bad road to be on?
I can just tell you your interview with Susan Collins demonstrates that's not true. There are Republicans who feel very strongly about this issue and have said so. And I think if more do, then we can establish a national standard, not a partisan standard, when it comes to the future of relationships with women. This, to me, from Susan Collins' comments, gives me hope that the Alabama voters will do the right thing, and we'll also see both parties coming to the same conclusion on this issue.
A final question on this, Senator. There's a criticism that that Al Franken was pressured not just because of the specific facts of the case, but Democrats wanted to look good in comparison to Republicans. What's your response?
I can tell you it was a painful process because of our personal friendships and relationships with Al and his family. There was no political calculation in here. It was just a painful moment when we made a decision, move forward on the Democratic side. I hope the Republicans will face that reality as well.
On taxes, Senator, what can Democrats do? This is moving into the conference committee, and Republicans have the votes to pass it. What are Democrats going to do?
Well, it did pass the Senate. There was only one Republican Senator, Bob Corker, who voted no. Susan Collins made it clear she's still waiting before she makes her final decision. I think others are in the same position. Jeff Flake, for example, of Arizona, made it clear that bringing up this issue about DACA and the Dreamers is critical to his vote when it comes to tax. So I can't assume where the Republicans will end, but they have an awful lot to accomplish in a very short period of time.
You mentioned DACA. Let's just go off on a side road there on that. A number of your Democratic supporters, colleagues, would like you as a Democrat to basically make funding of the government to keep the government running, would like you to make it contingent on doing something about DACA. Will you?
Well, I can tell you this. We don't want to see the government shut down. We want to move forward in a bipartisan fashion to solve our problems. We believe that DACA is central. The president is the one who made this the issue. September the 5th, he eliminated the DACA program and put in doubt the future of over 780,000 people in America. And we want to get this done and accomplished. 34 Republicans in the House came out last week and said, do it before the end of the year. Senate Republicans have said the same thing. Lisa Murkowski yesterday tweeted that her Christmas wish, her greatest Christmas wish, is to see this done, DACA and the Dreamer issue resolved this calendar year. It is within the power of the Republicans to get this done and to put together a package that we can pass. We want to stand by them, work with them, and get that done.
Nothing focuses the mind like a deadline, though, and using the deadline of the funding as leverage, both for this and also the children's health insurance, 9 million children, that still is yet to be dealt with. You at one point said, I'm not prepared to go home for the holidays until we get our work done. That suggests a little bit of use of this funding as a deadline, but are you really going to go that far?
Well, I feel very strongly about it. There are many important issues. DACA, to me personally, and the DREAM Act are very personal and mean an awful lot. But when we're talking about funding our government, providing the resources and programs that mentally income families use across America, dealing with the opioid crisis, making certain that we take care of our veterans, making certain that we have the money for biomedical research, these are part of the conversation and part of the dialogue as we close down this budget. It is up to the Republicans to make a decision about what we will do. I think we can get this done right.
Final question, Senator. You're on the Judiciary Committee. There have been some questions raised about inspectors, people working for the special counsel, one of whom sent disparaging texts about the president, and then another who went to Hillary Clinton's victory party and also praised blocking the president's travel ban. How big of a deal do you think this is, that these questions are being raised?
Let me say at the outset, I have the highest confidence in Bob Mueller. I also have confidence that if he has any questions about the motives or conduct of his staff, he will act on it decisively and professionally. He is moving forward on this investigation. I trust him. If there is something that went wrong in terms of the staffing, I trust him to take care of it.
All right, Senator, that's it. We're out of time. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be right back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. For a closer look at some of the major issues we're facing abroad, we turn to Kori Schake, who is a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Her new book is Safe Passage, the transition from British to American hegemony. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institution, is here, and he, of course, is in Washington. Corey, let me start with you. I tried to get the UN ambassador to give me a sense of why now on Jerusalem. Why now?
It's not clear why now. I think the White House is hoping that it will push the peace process forward by, as Nikki Haley said, taking Jerusalem off the table. I think that's unlikely to prove true. I think it's going to make the peace process a lot more complicated because it doesn't look like they had anything to offer Palestinians. And so it's surprising that other countries in the region care less, in part because they need more cooperation from Israel now than before.
Michael, what's your view? People see this violence. How should they see this? Big deal? Should they be nervous? What's your sense?
Well, I'm glad you asked it that way, John, because I think it's a medium deal. It's not the end of the world. President Trump didn't say that East Jerusalem could never be the capital for Palestine. He didn't make any other such declarations that were really out of what we all expect in any kind of a final peace agreement anyway. And of course, the peace process, even though Corey's totally right that this is not helpful for the peace process, it wasn't exactly going anyplace anyway. So I think there are bigger questions about what kind of leverage can we create with both parties. And perhaps we need to think harder about that. But I don't see this as more than what my colleague Natan Sachs calls an unforced error. In other words, it's not a tragedy. It's probably a mistake. It probably complicates the atmosphere. I'm not sure it really changes the terms of any potential peace deal or really impedes any negotiation that was having any momentum to begin with.
Let's talk now about a place where an unforced error could lead to a tragedy, which is North Korea. Corey, what's happening right now? Americans hear, it's perilous, and then the issue goes away, and then it becomes perilous again. How should people think about this?
Well, I am more concerned about it now. I think what I hear out of the White House parallels pretty closely what the Bush administration sounded like in 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, that the leadership of North Korea is fundamentally erratic and untrustworthy, that retaliation is inadequate as a strategy, and I think they're not thinking through quite carefully enough, for example, what Asia will look like geopolitically if the United States engages in a preventative war that the Australians, Japanese, and South Koreans don't want and might not participate in.
Michael, Corey raises 2003. This president has said that lead up to the Iraq War and the war itself was the greatest blunder in American history. So parallels to that. That should make people nervous.
And this would probably be 100 times more lethal for Allied forces than the Iraq War. We have to keep that in mind. Let's say the North Koreans can only detonate 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but they're over Seoul. Then we have up to a couple 100,000 Americans in Seoul. Leave aside the issue of whether the families of American servicemen should come home. There are a lot of American civilians who just live there doing business. So if we were to have a war in Korea, the estimates are that one nuclear explosion over that densely populated city could kill about 2 or 3 times as many people as the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. And that's for one explosion. So anything that leads us towards a higher probability of nuclear war, I think is probably a huge mistake. But there is, I don't want to be too scary, there is one potential interpretation of what's going on that's a little more hopeful, which is that the Trump administration really doesn't have particular interest at the end of the day in launching a preventive war, but by creating the sense that they're impatient, they're trying to persuade China to turn the economic screws more forcefully and try to get us in a better bargaining position. I'm not comfortable with this situation because I don't know if what I just said is true. And if the alternative interpretation is true, then we could be in for a horrible war, the worst since World War II.
Moreover, the administration is painting themselves into a corner with the rhetoric, even if it is just intended to make the Chinese more cooperative. They're saying that the sand is slipping through the hourglass and we might have to act soon, and the military option is the only option if this doesn't work. And that actually, I think, not only creates a red line, it attaches a ticking clock to it.
If I could add, the question, too, I agree 100% with Corey. The question is, what are the military options under consideration? All-out preventive war is, of course, the extreme. There's also one idea that Ash Carter and Bill Perry, 2 former secretaries of defense of the Democratic Party, wrote about 10 years ago. They're not necessarily articulating it now, but 11 years ago, they suggested that we shoot down a North Korean ICBM launch before it either gets off the launch pad or before it gets out of the atmosphere, and just deny North Korea the ability to really learn more about its missile programs. That's a very dangerous idea, too, because you don't know what North Korea is going to do in response. But that's the sort of idea that may be in play here.
Let me step back here for a second and ask you all both a question about the larger buildup of forces. There is in the Congress a request for even more money than the president has asked for his defense budget. Corey, what do you think will happen with that? And do we need all this money?
I'm skeptical that the Congress is actually going to pass an appropriations bill that will give the Defense Department the $700 billion that authorizers in Congress have asked for. It looks to me much more likely that we will see a series of continuing resolutions. We're already a third of the way into the fiscal year. So I'm really skeptical, both because of the way the president's budget teed this up. So Congress is going to be adding $100 billion over what the president requested. But I'm also skeptical that they can get deals on the other things like DACA, like the spending distinction between domestic and national security. It looks to me like this is likely to drag on, and that's actually terrible for the Defense Department. Continuing resolutions prevent them starting new programs. It prevents the managerial latitude that DoD needs to use the money well. So rather than add more money, I would instead give DoD the latitude to do a lot more programmatic management. I think that would help them a lot more.
Michael, your thought?
Amen. I mean, we're at a point here in December, 2.5 months into the new fiscal year. We don't know if the defense budget is going to be $600 billion for this year or $700 billion. That's a huge gap, and that's roughly the range of play. And Donald Trump is sort of in between in his request. I'm sort of in between myself. The Congress, under Senator McCain and Congressman Thornberry and others, have proposed the $700 billion. Anything north of $600 billion exceeds the Cold War average when you adjust for inflation. I do think we need a bit more money. But I think what we need really is clarity and a decision, because you can't do proper training, maintenance, you can't enter into long-term contracts, you can't just do good custodianship of the Department of Defense when you're this far into the year and you don't know what your budget will be.
All right, that's it for both of you. Thank you so much. And we'll be right back to discuss the political news of the week with our political panel.
CBS News, real news.
And we turn now to our political panel. Molly Paul is national political correspondent for Time magazine. Their person of the year was the Silence Breakers and the Me Too movement. Lonnie Chen is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a policy advisor to the Romney and Rubio presidential campaigns. We're also joined by CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan and Ed O'Keefe, who covers Capitol Hill for the Washington Post and is a CBS News contributor. Margaret, I want to start with you on this question of Jerusalem. What do you make of this decision and the timing of it?
Well, this appears to have been a significant foreign policy and national security decision made primarily for domestic political reasons by the President of the United States. He succeeded in touching probably the most sensitive nerve in one of the most intractable conflicts in history. And this is going to make for a complicated visit for Vice President Pence, who has to head to Israel and to Egypt within just a week or so. But what the president appears to be doing here, it's interesting, with all due respect to the UN ambassador who was talking to you about making this decision. It doesn't do the things she said. It doesn't actually move the embassy. In fact, the president on camera signed a waiver keeping the embassy in Tel Aviv. And it doesn't, for the moment, decide the fate of Jerusalem. If you listen to the president's national security team, who says, actually, we're still up for negotiation on the final status. In fact, if you ask U.S. diplomats where the city of Jerusalem is located, they still won't tell you it's located in Israel. They'll just tell you it's the political capital. So it appears to be the kind of sleight of hand that allows the president to say he achieved a campaign objective, much like the Iran deal, without necessarily changing things, because any new embassy is going to take 4 years or more to build.
All right, let's now move back to domestic issues. Molly, let's go to Alabama here. We got a Senate race going to come to its conclusion next week. Where do you think things stand in this race?
I do not think we know how this is going to turn out. There has seemed to be a shift in the conventional wisdom toward Roy Moore. You hear a lot of predictions that he is going to prevail, because the beginning of the accusations against him is now several weeks in the rearview mirror, and has seen a lot of Alabamians have had a chance to sort of process that. But we have still seen polls that are quite equivocal, especially in such a red state. That's pretty remarkable. And what I have heard from my sources on the ground, and I'll be in Alabama in just a few hours, is that voters are pretty powerfully conflicted. You know, these are voters who generally want to favor the Republican, all other things being equal. But you have to remember that Roy Moore, even among Republicans, is a very polarizing figure. There's a lot of Alabamians who see him as an embarrassment to the state, or just as not the sort of person, particularly considering these charges, that they want representing them. So whether that is enough to put a Democrat over the top in a state like Alabama is very difficult to tell.
Lonnie, let me ask you about the reaction to the RNC supporting Roy Moore this week, the president supporting Roy Moore. There was some talk about and coverage in Republicans saying, I'm through with the party because they're supporting him. Now, that can get over-torqued in today's media environment, so it's hard to know what the level of real outrage. I mean, obviously, Ben Sasse said what he said. Senator Collins was disappointed, too. What's your sense of how big a deal this is outside of Alabama for the Republican Party where it is right now?
I think that it is a developing big deal, if that makes sense. As we go into 2018, this is not the last time we're going to see some version of this movie. In other words, I think you're going to continue to see this conflict between different parts of the Republican Party. And yes, it's played out in Alabama in a really concerning fashion. A guy like Roy Moore, clearly very flawed and very problematic. But you're going to have contested primaries potentially in states like Arizona, maybe even Nevada next year. So this battlefield is just being played out right now. People are just kind of stepping onto this battlefield. So I think to the extent that we're seeing this in Alabama now, what we're seeing is a microcosm of the kinds of battles we're going to see through 2018. And for Republicans like myself, it's very concerning because what you're seeing is a fundamental split and fracture in the party that we've known has existed for some time, but now is being played out in a very public way and being played out in elections that really do matter and have policy consequences for the last 2 years of President Trump's administration, at least for his first term.
Well, and Ed, and it was the policy implications President Trump was arguing for, basically saying, whatever you may believe, I want a Republican in that seat.
It worked for him because remember in the last few weeks of the presidential campaign, he was running around the country saying to Republicans, you may not like me, but I'm going to appoint conservative Supreme Court justices and other conservatives to the court. And it worked. 1 in 5 voters showed up, and the exit polls showed the Supreme Court was their top concern. Moore's making the same exact argument, and that may, in fact, end up working for him. What I find interesting, and what will be very curious to track in the next few weeks, is if he wins, how quickly does that ethics investigation begin? How long does it end up taking? And what do they do if it brings forward information that suggests conduct unbecoming of a senator? Susan Collins seemed to suggest today that would be a difficult, thing to do, to expel him. But the fact that there could be a secretive ethics investigation underway will just hang over the Republican Party on Capitol Hill over the course of most of the year, most likely. And, even talking to a colleague who takes photographs up at the Capitol, he says, I suspect most people are even going to avoid getting in the elevator with him because they just don't want to be associated with him at all.
And those are related to the allegations that he denies in terms of sexual misconduct. He doesn't deny having said that homosexual activity should be illegal. He doesn't deny having said that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to serve in the United States Congress. So there are things that are being set up here that not only highlight the divisions you talked about within the Republican Party, some would say the fight for the soul and the identity, but also position the Democrats here. And that's what was so interesting with the Al Franken resignation to come, was that the Democrats seem to be positioning themselves around that identity of this is what we are not. We are not going to play those cultural
I want to get to the Franken, and as you say, resignation to come. We still don't know what the end date on that is. But, Lenny, I wanted to go back to something you said because Mitt Romney, who you used to work for, came out and basically took the moral position above all other Republicans, basically, and said there's no reason to support Roy Moore, and it's a stain on the party. Then Steve Bannon came back at him from the... What did you make of that back and forth? Does it have any lasting impact? And is Mitt Romney sort of emerging here as something in the Republican Party? Put a name on it.
Well, you know, he's sort of the sensible conscience of the Republican Party. About what Steve Bannon has to say is to the extent that people think he's a proxy for the president. To the extent that people think that Steve Bannon's expressing a point of view that the president holds, then it's relevant. Otherwise, he's just a political pundit out there with another opinion. And the question really will be to what extent the president carries through this argument. If there is a Senate campaign to be had in Utah for Governor Romney, for example, to what extent is the president willing to go out there and prosecute some argument against Mitt Romney or try to find somebody to run against him? That's the only way it becomes relevant. Otherwise, it's all just a bunch of blather as far as I'm concerned. Now, it's very concerning blather because obviously what Bannon said was completely beyond the pale, what Bannon said about Governor Romney. But I think Governor Romney is putting out there a point of view that that needs to be articulated in the Senate and in the Congress beyond the 2018 election cycle.
Just so people aren't confused, Steve Bannon said that Governor Romney ducked service in Vietnam because he had a religious exemption. He went over, he was a missionary in France, which is a strange thing to say, given that his president, Trump, had many, many deferments from the Vietnam War. Let me, Molly, switch to you here on the question of Al Franken. You wrote about him this week, and you said he really didn't want to leave the Senate.
He really didn't seem to. I mean, if you saw the farewell speech that he gave, first of all, it took a lot of pressure to get him to resign. And what you saw was more than half of the Democratic caucus had to come out publicly. It wasn't enough. You know, we knew that there was pressure from behind the scenes on Senator Franken, and he resisted that pressure. And that was why his colleagues were forced to come out publicly, all the way up to the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer. And then finally, very grudgingly, Franken got up there on the floor of the Senate and said he believed it was ironic that he was resigning given the allegations against President Trump and against Roy Moore. This is a sort of whataboutism argument of the kind that we sometimes hear Trump make, right? Why is it fair that you're persecuting me? Look at what crooked Hillary did. It's the same kind of argument. And not only did he not apologize for his alleged misconduct, he took pains to clarify that he hadn't actually admitted to anything, and he cast doubt on some of his accusers. But he did accede to this pressure. There's a lot of resentment and disagreement in Democratic circles about whether this was the right thing to do. A lot of Democrats talking about where they're setting the standard and whether it's fair. Minnesota Democrats, very sad to lose Franken. The National Party, sad to lose someone who is probably the biggest fundraising draw for Democratic candidates across the country. And now you have a situation where, given that Minnesota was quite close in 2016, whoever the governor appoints to fill this seat is going to have to run again in 2018, and that could possibly be a tough race.
All right, we're going to pause that there. We'll be back in a moment with a little more on Al Franken plus taxes. Stay with us. And we're back with our political panel. Ed, Senator Durbin said there was no political calculation in the Al Franken decision. Do you buy that?
No, not at all. It was a total political calculation. We know that the week before he resigned, he was already facing pressure from his colleagues who were asked to hold off, and that the morning that the final allegations surfaced, they all got together by email and text and phone calls and said, this is it, we got to do this. The party wants to make, the Democrats want to make a competency and professionalism argument in November, believing that that is the way they can take back the House and the Senate. They got to purge all these guys in order to do that, because you can't sit there and have alleged bad actors in your party if you're trying to suggest that you would run the government better. More broadly, I think viewers deserve to know this. It's no secret for those of us who cover Congress that we have all, in one way or another, been contacted by lawmakers or their aides in recent days, privately asking, what else do you have? Who's next? They are terrified of this storyline, and they know the consequences of it now could lead to much bigger problems for their party, maybe for a piece of legislation they're working on, maybe the chance of the party holding together through the elections. But members in both parties, aides in both parties, very concerned that more is to come. And look, I think it's safe to say more is to come. We don't know who exactly it will be about. It will be carefully reported. But it shows you that they are so scared now because they realize so quickly people are disappearing. And think about it. We saw a guy who served for more than 50 years kicked out. We saw the party's one of the party's top fundraisers kicked out. A social conservative warrior, Trent Franks, had to resign amid a lot of questions about his behavior. And we've never seen this kind of a purge, not since the Civil War.
Margaret, I want to switch to taxes here because this is a big thing that's happening, too, and the president wants it signed by Christmas. What have you made of his salesmanship of the tax cut bill relative to health care, because the tax cut bill, according to both the Quinnipiac poll this week and Gallup, has only 29% support in the country. This is a president whose key skill is as a marketer. But that's not very popular for that legislation.
Well, he's marketing something that seems to be different than what is the product he's selling. And the message from the president, even just on Twitter, his constant focus on the stock market, it appears to be that he sees stocks and corporate profits as a proxy for the success of this bill and ultimately his end goal, even though on the campaign trail and when he goes out to sell this, he's talking about the benefit to the middle class and to the working class who help to support him. And it's not clear that these pieces at this point add up to a benefit for those people. At this point, though, to say that this would be a boost to corporations, undoubtedly it would, to take the corporate tax rate from 35 down to 20%. But you're not legislating how a corporation spends those profits, right? You're not necessarily forcing income growth. You're not making that worker take home more pay as a result. You can't possibly force that. You also can't force broader employment. So this gamble of how this will ultimately pay off to the broader economic benefit of the country is something that the president seems to be focusing on, whether you call it trickle-down economics or something else.
Lonnie, what did you make of Senator Rubio, who said Republicans should go back and look at a 1977 speech by President Reagan, or not President, then Governor Reagan, where he said the Republican Party has to worry about having a country club big business image?
Well, yeah, I think there's a point that he's making, right? Now, Senator Rubio and Senator Lee had an amendment to the tax bill that would have made the child tax credit fully refundable, which would have been a huge boon to lower middle class and lower income families. And unfortunately, that was voted down by the Senate. I think that point of view, though, suggests that what we're seeing in the tax bill now to Republicans, this is more of a feature and not a bug, right? That they're actually looking at lowering the corporate tax rate. This has been something Republicans, mainstream Republicans, have talked about now for years, if not decades. And so this is actually a relatively conventional tax bill. The difficulty in selling it, though, is how do you translate a corporate tax cut into what it means for the average middle-class worker? There is a strong argument to be made that this tax bill is going to boost growth, which is going to boost wages, which is going to go into the pockets of middle-class taxpayers. But that's not really the argument you're hearing. You're hearing this is a middle-class tax cut. So there's a little bit of dissonance in the messaging that they're going to have to get straight, but I think that it won't inhibit them from getting this bill through and to the president's desk in a matter of weeks.
Molly, 30 seconds. Do you agree? And also, do Democrats have any opportunity here to take advantage of this tax process?
Well, if you believe the Democrats, they are extremely excited about the political opportunity afforded by this tax bill. It is, as you mentioned, very similar to what happened with health care, where Republicans were sort of between a rock and a hard place. They wanted to keep a campaign promise, particularly to their own base, that Republican primary voters who they told they were going to repeal Obamacare and reform the tax system. But the bill itself was broadly unpopular, and it really is not clear whether what was worse for them politically, passing the bill or not passing the bill, given how disliked it is. And so, but what you do hear from Republicans is they feel they have to do this, A, because they think it's a good idea to cut taxes, and also because their base will be so dispirited if they don't get anything done this first year.
All right. Got to end it there. Thanks, Molly. We'll be right back.
Congress start resigning.
I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office.
Senator Al Franken takes a parting shot as he and two other members of Congress step down in the sexual harassment scandal. But President Trump doubles down on his support for Roy Moore.
This guy's screaming, "We want Roy Moore." He's right.
We'll discuss whether this will be a political issue in 2018 and the effort to change how Congress handles allegations of harassment with Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock and Democrat Debbie Dingell. Then, the president recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital, igniting protests across the Arab world.
The president does want us to move in a very concrete and steadfast way to ensure the embassy is located in Jerusalem.
We'll sit down with Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Plus, Republicans hammer Robert Mueller and the FBI as the Russia investigation closes in on the Trump inner circle. We'll ask our Sunday panel about GOP charges our top law enforcement agencies are pursuing a political agenda. And our Power Player of the Week, a conservative voice for the next generation.
If you're a conservative millennial, I think that you tend to be a little bit more idealistic, just as younger people are generally.
All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. Washington. The reckoning over allegations of sexual harassment came this week on Capitol Hill. Over the course of 3 days, the political careers of 3 lawmakers ended. On Tuesday, the retirement of the longest-serving member of Congress, John Conyers. And Thursday, the resignations of Senator Al Franken and Congressman Trent Franks. All this ahead of Tuesday's Senate contest in Alabama, where the Republican candidate, Judge Roy Moore, faces allegations of sexual misconduct with teenagers. In a few minutes, we'll talk with 2 leading congresswomen, Barbara Comstock and Debbie Dingell. But first, let's bring in Peter Ducey live in Birmingham, Alabama, with the latest on the special election. Peter.
Chris, the Senate candidate everybody has been talking about hasn't been seen in days. No events for Judge Roy Moore so far this weekend, but the Republican accused of sexual misconduct by multiple women is hoping to get by with a little help from President Trump and his friends. Election Eve in Alabama will feature a robocall from President Trump and a rally headlined by his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon. In a statement to Fox, the deputy campaign manager for the Moore campaign, Hannah Ford, says, quote, "Turnout is the key to victory, and we have pulled all hands on deck to activate Judge Moore's conservative and evangelical base. Our volunteers are on fire for the truth and are determined to stop pro-abortion, pro-taxes, pro-amnesty liberals from stealing their Senate seat." The Democrat Doug Jones is counting on heavy African-American turnout to flip the Senate seat Jeff Sessions held for 20 years and called in 2 potential 2020 contenders on Saturday, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, to help him beat up Roy Moore with suggestions that he wouldn't represent every Alabamian who asks for help.
Taking constituent calls, not caring if they're black or they're white. Don't let me get in trouble now. If they're gay or they're straight, it's about representing all of the people.
Something that's been overlooked lately, the write-in candidate. Many voters here still plan to write in their preferred Republican, even though nobody ever staged a formal write-in campaign, which means there are countless wild cards in this race. Chris?
Peter Ducey reporting from Birmingham. Peter, thanks for that. Back here in Washington, we're joined now by Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock of Virginia and Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan. And welcome both of you to Fox News Sunday. Let's start with Judge Moore and the Senate election in Alabama. On Friday night, President Trump spoke in Pensacola and gave Moore his full endorsement. Here it is.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. So get out and vote for Roy Moore.
Congresswoman Comstock, does that bother you as a Republican to see President Trump and the Republican National Committee both supporting Judge Moore, who faces several allegations of misconduct with teenage girls, one as young as 14?
Well, I was one of, I think, the first Republican woman to call for him to step aside. I was happy to see my friends like Senator Cory Gardner, who heads up the Senatorial Committee, Tim Scott, and many others, take the other side of that and say that we don't need to have him here. Now, the voters are going to decide on Tuesday, but I think what they're going to have is an ethics investigation. And what we've been doing on my committee is we've been hearing the voices of the women and the victims. And that is what is going to happen, because every woman has a story. Jeff Sessions said he believed these women. And I think if Roy Moore doesn't underperform like he has in the past, and he's here, he'll be facing the Ethics Committee.
But I want to ask you directly, does it bother you as a Republican Congresswoman to see President Trump and the Republican National Committee supporting Roy Moore?
Yes, I mean, it doesn't represent me. I don't think it represents most of the Republican women, as well as my colleagues like Senator Tim Scott and others, and Cory Gardner have made clear.
Congresswoman Dingell, Democrats moved fast this week to push both John Conyers, your fellow congressman from Michigan, and Al Franken, senator from Minnesota, to step down. And there are signs that your party is trying to seize the moral high ground on this issue. Take a look.
Where is their outrage? In fact, on the opposite end, they're coming forward to support Roy Moore. How's that for totally inappropriate positions? Is
there a difference in how the two parties are handling this issue of sexual harassment and among members of Congress? And is that a legitimate issue in the 2018 campaign?
I think that the voters are going to hold everybody accountable, whether you're Republican or Democrat, when the 2018 campaign happens. This has probably been was the most difficult week of my career. When you look at somebody like John Conyers, who had the legacy that he did, have to step aside. But this has been going on for a very long time, Chris. We know what our values are. I don't consider this a partisan issue. I find it, I mean, Barbara and I totally agree on this issue. I've also called that I think Congressman Farenthold should resign. $84,000 is a lot of money, and it wasn't for nothing. We cannot have a double standard. And we still have somebody running for office. We still have somebody in the White House that has acknowledged that they have done things that are not okay, or at least the president has. So it's disturbing. But we have to know who we are, and I think we're all going to be held accountable, next Republican or Democrat, next November.
But do you see a difference in the president and Roy Moore on the one hand, and pushing out Conyers and Franken on the other, and Democratic leaders demanding that they leave?
I think that everybody's got to be accountable. So I think those that aren't making, I mean, there are, as you've seen, sitting at this table, Republicans are calling for this man to step down, and Republicans have even criticized the president for what he did. I think we know what our values are. I think we know what we stand for, and I think the American people are going to hold people accountable next November.
It's been clear from the past month, these issues aren't partisan. They've been in the media, they've been in entertainment, and that's why we took a look in Congress. I'm on the Committee of Jurisdiction. We were looking at this issue even before some of these stories came forward, because we knew if we were seeing what we saw in media, in the entertainment industry, and across all industries, that it was going to be in Congress too. And that's why we're going to change the procedures. We've already passed resolution, my bill on having mandatory training. And we know there's a lot more that we need to do, both in Congress as well as with the public at large. So I think it's important, as Debbie said, that this not be seen as partisan, because it's a watershed moment where men and women are coming together across the partisan divide to change the culture here. And that's why you're seeing people leaving, Democrat and Republican. There's still some Democrats and Republicans there who have been asked to leave, who haven't left yet, but this is still going to be playing out. But let's focus too on the women and their stories, because we need to see what their stories are and how we can make them whole. And that's the real problem here, is that women have been denied their careers because of these men in power. And it's a power abuse, not really about sex so much as power abuse.
Talk about that. We'll talk about reforms in a moment. But let's review what we have seen on Capitol Hill just recently. Excuse me, 3 members of Congress resigned this past week. 3 more have either settled sex harassment cases or face allegations. Congresswoman Dingell, how widespread do you think this problem is? I've heard reports that as many as 30 or 40 members of the House and Senate may face allegations of sexual harassment.
I'm hearing those same rumors. The numbers grow each week. I don't know what the truth is, and I'm not going to deal in speculation. I'm going to tell you what I'm the most worried about, which is, and Barbara touched upon this, the only reason I didn't wander into it. I know this issue is very personal to me, but this isn't real. Everybody says this is a watershed moment. Is this really a watershed moment if it's not real for the tip waitress or the factory worker or somebody in a law firm or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor? And we need to look at the way that even those who have the courage to come forward in the last few weeks have been treated and been demonized. And that has been the people, we're all trying to wrap our head around this. It's happening so fast, and they're names that some had heard, some didn't know. We need to make sure that we come out of this, men and women together, changing the culture, working together as we go forward. So we've got to make sure that women who do have the courage to come forward aren't hurt, that their careers are not hurt, they're treated with respect, and those that, and we have fair processes, and we are improving workplaces across the country.
People have been shocked to learn, excuse me, how Congress handles sex harassment cases. And let's put some of this on the screen. There's a 90-day process, including counseling and a cooling off period before a staffer can file a complaint. The Office of Compliance has paid out more than $17 million in taxpayer funds to secretly settle workplace complaints, not all of them, but certainly some of them, about sex harassment. Congresswoman Comstock, you're working on legislation. What do you want to see? How much do you want to streamline that process for women to file complaints? How much disclosure, transparency do you want to see for people who have settled complaints in the past? And should we be naming past people, or should they somehow be protected?
No, I think we should be naming past people, and that should be fully disclosed. I think we may need to have maybe an outside counsel come in to totally review any of these cases to make sure we get that all out there. So I do fully support it. But also the priority needs to be on the victims and fundamentally changing the system so that the victims feel they have a process that works for them and advocates for them. So we've been advocating either having a counsel or an ombudsman or some type of advocate that protects the victims so they feel there's a system that allows them to come forward. But I think first we have to know who in the past, and those names should be disclosed. They're going to come out one way or the other, and they should. As you mentioned, all of that fund is not at all for sexual harassment. So whatever is sexual harassment should come forward, and I believe it will, and I support it. I also support non-disclosure, for them not having to honor those non-disclosure agreements. The woman in the Alcee Hastings case contacted my office. I spoke with her this weekend. She's already speaking out, and we need to make sure that women like her will be protected to come forward and talk, and I fully support protection for those women.
I got less than a minute left. Congresswoman Dingell, is this going to change? I mean, it's pretty easy to pass this resolution. Everybody has to get training. But are we going to see a real change in the way Congress handles these cases and the naming of people who have settled these at taxpayers' expense in the past?
I think
that there is total concurrence that there must be transparency and that we should never use taxpayers' money to pay for somebody's irresponsible, just despicable, unacceptable behavior. Though I think everybody's trying to figure out how do you make sure that you take care of the survivor and that the survivor doesn't have consequences. Too much of this has consequences. And going forward, Chris, we need a conversation in this country that needs to happen at dinner tables, in churches, in barbershops, in every place across the country. Men and women and families have got to work together on this.
All right. Thank you. And we do need to point out that this is not just about members of Congress, although that certainly is egregious. It's in all businesses, including our own. Congresswoman Dingell, Congresswoman Comstock, thank you both for coming in today.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss how big an issue the sex harassment scandal may turn out to be in the 2018 midterm elections.
I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Al Franken taking a parting shot at President Trump and Roy Moore in his resignation speech on the Senate floor. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, Rachel Bade, who covers Congress for Politico, and the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham. Well, Democratic women moved with stunning speed on Wednesday to demand that Al Franken step down. Here's a sample.
Enough is enough. I mean, this is a conversation we've been having for a very long time, and it's a conversation that this country needs to have.
It was really difficult for each of us to come to this point, what I would call a tipping point for each of us.
Speaker Gingrich, I think it's fair to say that you're no fan of Al Franken, but you had an interesting reaction to him being pushed out. You said this, quote, "This is a party which is losing its mind," talking about the Democrats. "They suddenly curled into this weird puritanism, which feels a compulsion to go out and lynch people without a trial." Question, why was this a lynching?
He's never faced his accusers. He's never had due process. He's never had an opportunity to clear his name. Suddenly, and then you saw it in the way you described it, suddenly all of the social pressure of the left wing of the Democratic Party came together, made it inappropriate for him to stay. Now, 1 million people had elected him. and 30 people decided he was inappropriate. Now, they haven't decided yet that Bob Menendez, by the way, who has a much more interesting story to tell, is inappropriate. This is purely and simply hysteria.
Is it also politics? I mean, it was interesting because I asked the two congresswomen, they backed away from that. But do you think they're Democrats trying to make this an issue?
Maybe between, I was told by a reporter who really tries to pay attention to stuff, that to some extent the blowback on Nancy Pelosi when she tried to defend John Conyers was so intense from the left that everybody else on the left suddenly said, got it, lynch mobs are in this week, let's go lynch somebody, Franklin's available. The part of the thing amazing to me is here's a guy who wrote #1 bestseller, Giant of the Senate, supposedly a very funny book. He's a comedian. We all know he's a comedian. He was a comedian before he ran. And he just crumbles under the social pressure. I mean, there was no objective force to kick him out. He wasn't going to be expelled. He just couldn't take the social ostracism.
Chuck, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine said that we've got a new standard here and that people who are elected to office will be judged, among other things, on their behavior before they took office. Do you have any problem with the pressure on Franken to resign? Was this, as the Speaker says, a lynching?
I think it's highly inappropriate to call anything like this a lynching when you think about the history of what actual lynchings really were in this country. Having said that, I would add that I think for a lot of women, they may feel like, well, you know, when in the past these things came up, there wasn't so much speed about addressing the complaints, that they got swept under the rug. What we're into right now, though, as these sort of extreme points of view show, is a situation where, contrary to Senator Kaine, there isn't a new standard. There is a shifting standard. There is not an established rule here either about what a fireable offense is or what the procedure should be, and at the end of the procedure, what the punishments should be. So I think, you know, what the Democrats politically are trying to do by ousting Franken is establish we are consistent. We are the party that, you know, means what it says and says what it means. I would suspect that's going to be very difficult, actually, to sustain a consistent view of this, because every case is going to be a little different, and the politics are going to change constantly. And I think that was the wisdom of your two guests when they said this isn't a partisan matter, because truthfully, as cases come along, you're going to see it's very hard to be consistent about this.
Let me just pick up with Rachel, because you cover Congress. As you watch what was unfolding in the Senate on Wednesday, when all of the Democratic women senators called for him to leave, and then a lot of the men followed, how much of this was genuine outrage? And how much of it was whatever, whether it was because of the Pelosi or whatever, a decision, we're going to distinguish ourselves from the Republicans and Trump and Roy Moore and make this an issue for 2018?
I think it was both. From what we were hearing, these women in the Senate had been talking and texting about Franken, and they were uncomfortable with what the stories they were hearing, and there was sort of this agreement that if one more credible accuser came forward, they would all jump together and ask him to resign, and that's what you saw happen. However, I do think politics is seeping into this. Democrats have long sort of fashioned themselves as the party of women, and right now they're trying to show their base that they don't only espouse these verbally, but they act on these as well, and they're going to try to claim they have the moral high ground when 2018 comes and say, we pushed our members out who had this issue. However, I do not think this is just Democrats, of course, right? You have a president who is embracing a candidate in Alabama who has been accused of child molestation, right? I know there's a bunch of Republicans on the Hill who are very uncomfortable with this and think that he's only doing this because of politics. And I think that that's why you saw Speaker Paul Ryan today push out one of his own members, Trent Franks of Arizona, over allegations that he also had sexually harassed women.
Well, let's talk about Roy Moore. Here's an ad that an outside group is running against Moore in Alabama right now.
I want defense. That's why I can't vote for Roy Moore. What he's done and what he stands for makes us Republicans and us Christians look bad.
Michael, talk about the politics of the Roy Moore thing in terms of the sexual harassment issue. Also, does Moore win? And if he wins, will the Republicans in the Senate refuse to seat him or vote to expel him, which we heard a lot of talk about in the beginning, we're not hearing so much about now?
Yeah, I think it looks like Roy Moore will win, and I think it looks like they'll have a Senate ethics investigation if he comes there. And I think Roy Moore should welcome that. He will be a more effective legislator if these allegations can be investigated, if the truth can come out, if that's not something that hangs over him. And the entire United Senate can be more effective at legislating if rather than every time you walk down the hall, you have to talk about this, that, or the other, and instead can point to an investigation. It relates to Al Franken. I mean, the other thing that didn't come out in this conversation about Al Franken is that Al Franken had absolutely no interest in being a serious legislator. He introduced 141 pieces of legislation amendments. Not a single one in his entire career, including time with a Democrat president, was ever signed into law. Al Franken was a mean-spirited bulldog who had no purpose in the United States Senate if he couldn't be a mean-spirited bulldog, which he couldn't do with these allegations out there. He wasn't interested in being a legislator before. He isn't interested in being a legislator now, and I think that's part of why he stepped down, and he stepped down without even having the grace to say that he's sorry or apologize for any of this.
So let me just point out, not an Al Franken fan?
That's exactly
right. We have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later. Coming up, tensions flare over President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We'll report on the latest. And we'll talk with the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, about the fallout. That's next. Trump keeps a major campaign promise that fuels tension across the Arab world.
Israel is a sovereign nation with the right, like every other sovereign nation, to determine its own capital.
We'll ask UN Ambassador Nikki Haley about the move next on Fox News Sunday. President Trump broke with decades of U.S. policy this week and set off protests around the world by declaring the United States now recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In a moment, we'll discuss the move with Nikki Haley, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. But first, let's get the latest from Connor Powell in Jerusalem.
The violence so many predicted was likely to occur following President Trump's unilateral decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital continued for a fifth straight day. As demonstrators in Beirut and Jakarta marched on the U.S. Embassy early Sunday morning. In the Palestinian territories, protesters clashed with security forces at Israeli checkpoints in Bethlehem and other Palestinian cities. 2 Palestinians have been killed and more than 1,000 injured, while the Israeli Air Force launched airstrikes in Gaza following the launch of rockets by Hamas. 2 militants were killed. But it's not just Muslim and Arab countries protesting President Trump's decision. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson faced a barrage of criticism in Europe this week. From France to Great Britain to Turkey, some of America's closest allies demanding answers why the White House made this decision now, receiving nothing in return that would move the peace process forward. Vice President Pence will arrive here in the Holy Land for a visit next week, and already Palestinian leaders are saying they won't meet with him, believing the U.S. has crossed a red line with this decision that undermines past American efforts to act as an honest broker of peace here. Chris?
Connor Powell reporting from Jerusalem. Connor, thank you. Joining me now, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Let's start with President Trump's reasoning in making this move. Here he is.
This is a long overdue step to advance the peace process and to work towards a lasting agreement.
Ambassador, how does recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and starting to move our embassy there specifically, how does that advance the peace process?
Well, first of all, you have to, just say what's realistic. I mean, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That's why the parliament's there, the Supreme Court's there, the president and the prime minister are there. So the United States has always had its embassy in the capital city. And so Israel should be no different. There have been presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle that have all said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And so what we have said is enough talking about it. Let's do it. This is the will of the American people. The president wanted to follow through. Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama all said they were for it, but never did anything about it. And this president said it's time. And we think this is actually going to help us fastball the peace process going forward.
But I've got to tell you, I don't have to tell you that President Trump's decision is being criticized from all corners. Let's just take a quick rundown. Palestinian leader Abbas calls it a declaration of withdrawal from the peace process. British Prime Minister May calls it unhelpful in terms of prospects for peace in the region. Pope Francis expressed profound concern. Question, what are Abbas and May and even the Pope missing?
You know, I mean, leaders understand that courage is important, and we don't do things just to please every other country in the world. We do things to advance the ball, and that's what the president did with this. He said, this is time that we acknowledge reality. It's been 22 years in the making. It was time. And not only that, Chris, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Israel should be no different. We didn't set any parameters. We didn't say this was the final status. What we said is we're going to do like we do in every other country, and we're going to put the embassy in its capital, and we're going to continue and are going to continue that fact that we are as committed to the peace process as we've ever been before, and we're going to keep going until we get it.
I want to pick up on something you said in that last answer. Are you suggesting that despite President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, to begin to move the embassy there, that the final status of Jerusalem is still up for negotiation, that in a negotiation, East Jerusalem could still end up as the capital of the Palestinian state? And again, if so, why make this move now?
Well, I think the president, if you notice in his speech, he made a point not to talk about borders or boundaries. What he did was say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and that we're moving our embassy there, because he strongly believes that those final status issues should be decided between the Palestinians and the Israelis. No outside group should decide what the final status looks like, and we're leaving it up to them to do that. At the end of the day, they have to be comfortable with the peace process and the resolution that we come up with. We just want to support them in that process.
So again, specifically, East Jerusalem, if that's the result of the negotiation, East Jerusalem could still be the capital of a Palestinian state.
We will respect anything that the two parties come together on.
I want to talk about something else that happened this week. You spoke before the UN Security Council when they met on this subject, and you called out some of your fellow ambassadors. Here you are.
Over many years, the United Nations has outrageously been of the world's foremost centers of hostility towards Israel. The UN has done much more damage to the prospects for Middle East peace than to advance them.
Why, Ambassador, why was that helpful?
Because it's the facts. I mean, ever since I have gotten to the United Nations, there have been repeated attempts to hit Israel for no reason whatsoever. It's Israel bashing sessions, constantly trying to find ways to pick at them, and we've seen that start to diminish. But I want the Security Council and all of the international community to understand, when you bully Israel, you are not helping the peace process. And we see Israel as one of our best allies. We're not going to put up with it anymore. So when we see it, we call them out on it. It's time for them to realize that all of these things they've done to Israel have only hurt the process. We need to treat Palestinians and Israelis fairly. We need to hope that they both come together for a peaceful solution, and we need to support both of them. That has not happened for years in the United Nations, but it's starting to happen now.
Now, there has been a suggestion of a resolution to criticize or condemn the president's move in the Security Council. Of course, you would veto that, so the suggestion is perhaps it would be the UN General Assembly that would pass a resolution. What would the U.S. reaction be to that?
Oh, I would have a strong reaction to that. We have the right to do whatever we want in terms of where we put our embassies. We don't need other countries telling us what's right and wrong. And, you know, what I have always said is if we are honest, if we tell the truth, that's when peace comes. And this was the president telling the world the truth. And this was him going through with the will of the American people who had asked for 22 years to get this done. And he had the courage to show it. And I think a lot of Americans have a huge sigh of relief because of it. And now, hopefully, we can see the peace process really come together.
I want to change trouble spots in the world on you, which is part of your job, because at the same time, the United States is calling on the rest of the world, the United Nations, to impose and force sanctions against North Korea. You say that the world has cut off 90% of trade with North Korea, but only 30% of oil to North Korea. And I guess my question is, after all the efforts President Trump has made to cajole China, to pressure China, why is it that Chinese President Xi is not doing more?
Well, I think what we are seeing is that China is actually following through with the sanctions. They are, as is the international community. And I'll tell you, when we talked about leadership earlier, the United States is the one that led the entire international community to basically oust North Korea and say that they had to denuclearize and cut everything off. So we've done a great job at doing that. China has followed through on the sanctions. But to be clear, China can do more. And we're putting as much pressure on them as we can. The last time they completely cut off the oil, North Korea came to the table. And so we've told China they've got to do more. If they don't do more, we're going to take it into our own hands, and then we'll start to deal with secondary sanctions.
Well, I was going to ask you, why is it? Because certainly President Trump has launched a charm offensive and also a threatening offensive towards China. Why is it that President Xi refuses to do more?
Well, I think, President Xi has his reasons to have red lines. But President Trump and President Xi have a very good relationship. And for that, I think that's why we've gotten as far as we have in getting what we've gotten done. But President Trump is really starting to put the pressure on, saying that they've got to do more. Now it's time for China to respond.
Let's continue in the region. The U.S. Olympic Committee says it intends to send a full U.S. team to the Winter Olympics in South Korea in February. But this week you said that that is still an open question. Here you are.
I think it depends on what's going on at the time in the country. We have to watch this closely, and it's changing by the day.
Changing every day. So what is the status on this Sunday? Is the U.S. going to send a full U.S. Olympic team to South Korea or not?
Yes, we are. The only thing is we're doing in this Olympics what we've done in every single Olympics. If you look back, we have always talked about security in the Olympics. We've always talked about keeping our athletes safe. This is no different. And we are looking at the circumstances just to make sure we're doing everything we can. We're at the locations. We're starting to secure the process. But we always look out for the best interests of United States citizens. But yes, there will be a delegation that goes, and we will do everything we can to make sure they're safe.
Now, you say a delegation, the full U.S. Olympic team.
Yes, the full U.S. Olympic team.
During your time at the UN, Ambassador, I think it's fair to say you have stood out for your blunt, sometimes undiplomatic talk for a diplomat. Just the other day, you said if there's war, that North Korea, the regime there, will be utterly destroyed. Why such tough talk?
It's the truth. I mean, the reality is if North Korea even attempts to try and threaten the United States or any one of our allies, they will be utterly destroyed. Diplomacy is great in some respects, but you have to also be honest. And this was something that North Korea needed to hear and the international community needed to hear. North Korea has pushed the envelope to an extreme level. The United States isn't going to put up with it. And the international community has also rallied around saying that North Korea has to denuclearize. But that's just the honest facts. If North Korea attempts to threaten or do anything to destabilize us or our allies, we absolutely will utterly destroy them.
So, given how well you reflect President Trump's approach, whether you call it diplomatic or undiplomatic, there's been a lot of speculation that if Secretary of State Tillerson were to leave his job sometime early next year, that the president might ask you to take the job. And you said this week that you would, quote, not take it. And I guess my question is, why on earth not?
I have said for months that I am not interested in the Secretary of State position, and it's because I know that I am valuable here at the United Nations. I'm able to negotiate. I'm able to move the ball. I'm able to really diplomatically do what I need to, and then sometimes not diplomatically do what I need to. And so I think I'm effective, and I try and do the best I can for the president as well as the American people. And so that's why I choose to stay in New York.
I just want to follow up quickly because I can understand why, given the fact that Tillerson hasn't left, you would say that. But I mean, are you making a Sherman-esque? And as a Southerner, you'd understand what that means, a Sherman-esque comment? Absolutely not. You would not take the Secretary of State job?
I would not take it. I am perfectly happy in New York and trying to be as effective as I can, and will continue to do so as long as the president will allow me to serve.
Ambassador Haley, thank you. Thanks for your time this weekend. Always good to talk with you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Next, we'll bring back the panel to discuss the troubled state of Robert Mueller's Russia probe. Plus, what would you like to ask the panel about GOP allegations of bias in the investigation? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and we may use your question on the air.
Unacceptable for FBI employees to permit their own political predilections to contaminate any investigation.
There is no finer institution than the FBI, and no finer people than the men and women who work there and are its very beating heart.
The chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte, questioning the impartiality of the FBI, while new director Christopher Wray defended his agency. And we're back now with a panel. Well, there were several allegations this week about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe. First, that lead agent, FBI agent Peter Strzok, was taken off the case in July after Mueller learned he was sending anti-Trump messages to a colleague. Second, that top Justice Department official Bruce Orr had undisclosed meetings with two people involved with the so-called Russia dossier. Michael, how seriously does this compromise the Mueller investigation?
Well, I think it certainly raises issues that need to be addressed. I mean, the entire purpose of the Mueller investigation, the reason many of us embraced it, was that the American people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to have a quick and thorough investigation so that we can move on from these innuendos and claims of things that have gone on. Now you look at this, the very best thing that can be said about Peter Strzok is he's completely unprofessional. For somebody in that role to be sending anti-Trump, pro-Hillary tweets. The FBI refuses, the Justice Department refuses to talk about what role did this Russian dossier that now we find out a top Justice Department official was involved in talking with the person who put it together. What role did that play in getting a FISA warrant to be able to investigate members of the Trump campaign? You have investigators on Mueller's team who've spent over $60,000 supporting Hillary Clinton and Democrats, defending the Clinton Foundation, defending Ben Rhodes, Barack Obama's national security advisor.
That was all before.
All before that. All of these are things that cause anybody who looks at this situation to say, is it possible for this team to put forward a fair investigation? I think Bob Mueller needs to come forward and regain the trust of the American people, give us confidence that this is all just coincidence and that there can be a fair investigation.
Rachel, clearly, as Michael lays them out, there are some legitimate issues and questions here. On the other hand, do you believe from your reporting that there is a concerted effort by Republicans both in the White House and in the Senate and House to discredit the Mueller investigation as it begins to get closer to the Trump inner circle?
Yeah, I definitely say there are some Republicans, namely Trump allies in the House, who are revving up the campaign to discredit the investigation. We saw that this week with the clip you played with Goodlatte talking about tainted agents that the FBI needs to rid itself of. They also accused the FBI, of course, of botching the Clinton email investigation. However, I think there's sort of a split right now in the Republican Party, and we're going to see that evidence of that going forward. There are some, like Devin Nunes, who chairs the House Intelligence Committee that is investigating the investigator, who are calling for the FBI to be held in contempt of Congress. But you have people like Speaker Paul Ryan, Lindsey Graham, Trey Gowdy, the oversight chairman. You don't hear a lot of that coming from them. And so I think there are some Republicans who want to let Mueller do his job and don't want to sort of make this a partisan mudsling. So.
We ask you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Michael P. Mulhall. He writes, have the revelations of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation met the threshold for dismissal yet? Was it an egregious mistake by Special Counsel Mueller to stack his team with such highly partisan lawyers? And that's referring to what you said, Michael, about folks who had a history of supporting Democrats. Speaker Gingrich, how do you answer, Michael?
Well, I think it's been a great disappointment. When Mueller was first picked, I tweeted that I thought he had a great reputation that should stabilize the situation. Then he hires somebody like Weissman, who both has a terrible record of prosecutor overreach, and now we know was at the Clinton election night party.
This is Andrew Weissman.
Andrew Weissman.
Senior
You start going down the list here. I think the number of pro-Clinton, anti-Trump people he's hired makes you wonder what he's doing. The other thing is to look at, Hillary gets discussion, I think, for 4 hours, never under oath, so she can't possibly have committed perjury. Meanwhile, you get General Flynn after 35 years in service. Now, he did something bad. Of course, Hillary's top two aides clearly committed perjury, but they don't get attacked. I mean, the imbalance in the Justice Department's entire process between the Clinton investigation and the way they've gone after the president is just, I think, staggeringly corrupt. I don't think any word short of corrupt explains the gap between the way these two things have been handled.
I know you want to talk about that, but I'm going to switch and I'm going to talk about us, because we, the media, have become part of this story. And I want to turn to the reporting on the Russia investigation in the last couple of weeks, because there have been at least 3 cases of media reporting damaging stories about Donald Trump, putting them up and then having to take them down. Perhaps the most damaging, and as it turned out the worst mistake, was ABC's Brian Ross, who reported on General Michael Flynn after he pleaded guilty. Here he is.
He's prepared to testify that President Trump, as a candidate, Donald Trump, directed him to make contact with the Russians, which contradicts all that Donald Trump has said at this point.
But it turned out that that reporting was wrong. He said that candidate Trump had urged Flynn to reach out to the Russians. No, he later had to clarify it was President-elect Trump urging Flynn to reach out to the Russians after the election, which is a very different thing. I guess the question is, Chuck, particularly at a time when Donald Trump is bashing us as fake news, this isn't helpful.
It is not. What is helpful is that Brian Ross appears to have been disciplined. I think he was suspended for a month. And that will be at least a beginning toward correcting any of these flaws that come up. I think, as the Speaker's comments about Bob Mueller and this situation, what they have in common is that this situation calls for an honest broker, right? Whether it's a Justice Department or the media or whatever, the public would be best served by institutions that everyone accepted as impartial and factual. And the whole idea of honest brokers, though, is breaking down in our country across the board. And people don't trust institutions. They don't trust the federal government. They don't trust the media, et cetera, et cetera. And so when mistakes are made, people will accept them if they are perceived to be made in good faith. What we have now is a situation where people believe these mistakes are being made in bad faith, and the president is encouraging that belief.
Some would argue that the reporters are encouraging that too.
The New York Times took out a full-page ad saying that the truth matters now more than ever. I would love to know why the truth matters more now than it did 3 years ago.
Well,
the media acts like Donald Trump is doing something wrong.
Brian Ross doesn't work for the New York Times, and what I might add that it was the Washington Post. Okay, it was the Washington Post that corrected a mistake on CNN that was damaging to Donald Trump. The media is also right now, at least one newspaper I work for, targeted by groups trying to feed it fake news.
If I read one more story in the press about the fact that the President of the United States likes Big Mac and Filet-O-Fish sandwiches rather than Jose Andres restaurants, I don't know what I'm going to do.
I mean, that might be true.
Who cares? And the fact that they all act like it's a big deal.
I will point out that was included in the book that's just been written by 2 Trump supporters, Corey Lewandowski and David Blasey. I got to say, that's a lot of calories. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday. Up next, our Power Player of the Week, a leading voice for conservative millennials.
All in. President Trump urging voters to elect a man credibly accused of sexually abusing 2 young teenage girls to the U.S. Senate from Alabama.
Vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
But not everyone in the Republican Party is with the president. The senior senator from Alabama, a Republican who did not vote for Roy Moore, is here next. Plus, historic move.
We finally acknowledged that Jerusalem is Israel's capital.
President Trump checks off one of his campaign promises.
Sometimes you have to take risks. Leadership leads to peace.
But as violence erupts in the region, the question looms, will this lead in any way to peace? U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley joins me live. And digging deeper. A new report says Russian operatives reached out to one of President Trump's top advisors. And the evidence gathered by the special counsel against Trump's former campaign chair continues to swell. How much further up the chain will this go? The top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, is here ahead. Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is heading south. In just 2 days, voters will head to the polls in Alabama to choose a new U.S. senator. President Trump is now throwing the full weight of his presidency behind controversial Republican candidate Roy Moore, who has been credibly accused of sexually abusing 2 young teenage girls, including a 14-year-old. Moore has repeatedly denied the allegations. And this morning, we're learning President Trump has recorded a robocall for Moore ahead of the election. On Friday, the president held a campaign-style rally just over the Alabama border, explicitly calling on voters to choose Moore.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. So get out and vote for Roy Moore.
That endorsement from President Trump sure to offer Moore a boost in a state that Trump carried by nearly 30 points in 2016. Let's get right to Alabama's senior Republican Senator Richard Shelby, who joins us now from Tuscaloosa. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. You said that you already cast your ballot in the Alabama special election and that you chose to write in a candidate instead of voting for the Republican Roy Moore. The latest polls are neck and neck, showing Jones, the Democrat, leading by a hair. Perhaps when it comes down to it on Tuesday, who would you rather see win?
Well, I'd rather see the Republican win, but I would hope that Republican would be a write-in. I couldn't vote for Roy Moore. I didn't vote for Roy Moore, but I wrote in a distinguished Republican name, and I think a lot of people could do that. Will they do it? I'm not sure. I don't know what's going to happen. You know, as a Republican, I had to vote Republican. I wanted to vote Republican. I understand where the president's coming from. I understand we would like to retain that seat in the U.S. Senate. But I tell you what, there's a time, we call it a tipping point. And I think so many accusations, so many cuts, so many drip, drip, drip. When it got to the 14-year-old story, that was enough for me. I said, I can't vote for Roy Moore.
But you're going to wake up on Wednesday, and one of these two men, Roy Moore or Doug Jones, is going to be your fellow senator from Alabama. Which one would you rather deal with on a professional level?
Well, I don't have to answer that question today. I had rather see another Republican in there, and I'm going to stay with that story. I'm not going to vote for the Democrat. I didn't vote for the Democrat or advocate for the Democrat, but I couldn't vote for Roy Moore. The state of Alabama deserves better. I think we've got a lot of great Republicans that could have won and carried the state beautifully and served in the Senate honorably.
Will you tell us who you voted for, who you wrote in?
I am not going to tell you that any more than you do, okay?
Well, let me ask you. Roy Moore's accusers include Lee Korfman, who alleges that he sexually molested her when she was 14, and Beverly Nelson, who alleges he sexually assaulted her when she was 16. Do you believe these two Alabama women?
I think the women are believable. I have no reason not to believe them, just like the Attorney General Sessions said he had no reason or something not to believe the women. They were credible. But, you know, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened, but there's a lot of stories there. There's a lot of smoke. Got to be some fire somewhere.
Your fellow Republican Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, who's head of the Senate Republican campaign arm, the NRSC, he is calling for Roy Moore to be expelled if he wins the election on Tuesday. Back in November, Gardner said in a statement, quote, "If Moore refuses to withdraw and wins, the Senate should vote to expel him because he does not meet the ethical and moral requirements of the United States Senate." Do you agree?
Well, if he wins on Tuesday, the Senate, under the Powell case out of the Supreme Court, will have to seat him, and we'll see what happens after that. But I want to reiterate again, I didn't vote for Roy Moore. I wouldn't vote for Roy Moore. I think the Republican Party can do better.
Would it be appropriate for the Senate to launch an ethics committee investigation if he wins?
Well, I understand that's already being contemplated, but that would be up to the leadership and others to do that. I think that the Senate has to look at who's fit to serve in the Senate.
President Trump obviously is all in on Roy Moore. He recorded a robocall for him. He had a rally in Pensacola, Florida, just across the state line on Friday, where he urged his supporters to vote for Moore while also condemning his opponent, Democrat Doug Jones. Take a listen to the president.
He will never, ever vote for us. We need somebody in that Senate seat who will vote for our Make America Great Again agenda. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
If Roy Moore wins on Tuesday, I think it's fair to say that it will be because President Trump supported him. Do you wish President Trump had not provided cover for Roy Moore, that he'd stayed out of the race?
I think Roy Moore has his own following, regardless of whether the president's involved or others. I don't know what's going to happen Tuesday. It depends on the turnout and go from there. But I do believe, and I'm going to say it again, the Republicans could do better.
Your Democratic colleague Al Franken resigned from the Senate on Thursday after a wave of allegations of sexual harassment against him. Take a listen to what he said in his resignation speech.
I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Do the Democrats have a higher standard for behavior and conduct than the Republicans do?
Absolutely not, and I think you'll see all this play out. I believe whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, independent, whatever you are, that you would not put up with the conduct, bad conduct from a Democrat or a Republican, and that's going to be part of what's going to happen in the future. The Senate's going to have to weigh, if Roy Moore wins, his fitness to serve in the U.S. Senate.
And let's turn to the economy. Obviously, right now, taxes, the tax bill is in conference committee or is about to enter conference committee. Take a listen to something President Trump said on Friday.
Economic growth last quarter surged to 3.3%. The stock market is hitting an all-time high record for another, and think of this, 86 times since Election Day.
As the president just noted, the economy is doing quite well in many respects. Democrats say, why do you need to give a tax cut to big businesses and the wealthy if the economy is doing so well? What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that tax bill is just for a few people. It's for a lot. It's a lot of relief for a lot of the working people, middle class. It's probably something for just about everybody in the bill. That's how legislation comes about. I plan to support the bill when it comes out of the conference committee. I voted for it before. I think it's a step in the right direction.
He says it's going to boost the economy, though, and I guess the question is, does the economy even need boosting?
Well, the economy's good now, but it could be better. There's probably $5 trillion lying around in savings accounts and bank accounts in this country that looking for better investment. We can grow this economy more. We have to prove that we can, and I believe we will.
Senator Shelby, thank you so much for joining us. If I don't see you before,
thank you, Jake.
Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year, sir.
Thank you.
Violent clashes erupting after President Trump recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and now some new fallout for the U.S. as Vice President Pence is being snubbed. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, will be here to talk about that. Coming up next, stay with us. Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. Violent protests this morning near the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, after President Trump's decision earlier this week to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Riot police clashed with protesters, some of whom threw stones toward the gate of the embassy and burned Israeli flags. A new diplomatic fallout as well this morning. The Arab League is condemning the move by President Trump, saying, quote, the transformation of the policy of the United States of America toward Jerusalem is a dangerous development, and the United States has placed itself on the side of occupation, the violation of law and international resolutions, and as a result, it has isolated itself from the sponsorship and mediation of the peace process, unquote. Joining me now is the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Madam Ambassador, always good to see you. Thank you. The Arab League says this move has, quote, isolated the U.S. from the peace process. Your administration, of course, has made peace in the Middle East one of its top priorities. How does this move help that? How does it help the peace process in any way?
Well, let's first of all talk about what this does. This basically says that the United States acknowledges that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, and saying also that the embassy is going to be moved to the capital, just like it is in almost every other country. In Israel, in Jerusalem, you've got the parliament, you've got the president, you've got the prime minister, you've got the Supreme Court. So why shouldn't we have the embassy there? Secondly, I will tell you that for 22 years, you have had presidents and the American people ask for the embassy to be moved. And no president, not Clinton, not Bush, not Obama, actually had the courage to make that move and listen to the will of the American people. The Senate just overwhelmingly again voted to have the embassy moved. So the president did the will of the people. When it comes to those that are upset, we knew that was going to happen. But courage does cause that. When you make a decision, you're going to have some that see it negatively and you're going to have some that see it positively. But I strongly believe this is going to move the ball forward for the peace process.
How is it going to move the ball forward for the peace process? One of the things that's been pointed out, first of all, let me just say that I'm sure Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama would dispute the idea that that they didn't do it because of courage. But putting that aside, President Trump is supposed to be a master negotiator. Isn't this just cashing in a chit and getting nothing for it? How does this move the peace process forward in any way?
Not at all. And I will tell you, all the presidents wanted to do it, and everyone around them kept saying, don't do it, don't do it. This president said for 22 years, that waiting didn't help us. Now let's try and move the ball. What I will tell you is, you have to look at the situation that he just took Jerusalem off the table. He just took it off the table. So now they get to come together. They get to decide what the borders will look like. They get to decide the boundaries, and they get to talk about how they want to see Jerusalem going forward. All we did was say, this is not something that we're going to allow to happen in the middle of your negotiations. You come together and you decide what you want from the Israelis and the Palestinians for the peace process to look like. And that's what we're going to continue to do. And in terms of the Arab League, yes, they have said that, but we have a whole lot more in common with the Arab League than we've ever had before. And mainly that's because of our fight against Iran. And so, while this is one issue they disagree with, there's a whole lot of other issues that we're working very closely with them on.
I want you to take a listen to something that Dr. Saeb Erekat, the PLO Secretary General, said after President Trump's decision.
I think tonight he is strengthening the forces of extremists in this region as no one has done before. This is an act, a statement that's totally uncalled for, totally unacceptable. He's in total violation of international law, human rights, and he's turning the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis from a political one into a religious one. That's a very dangerous situation.
Do you have no concerns that this decision is going to weaken the moderate voices in the Arab world and strengthen the zealots?
No, because I have no concern, because what they mostly care about and what's their priority right now is Iran. And we are in lockstep with them. And we have done a great job of talking about how we're going to fight extremists. Jake, when the president made this comment on Wednesday, everybody said the sky was going to fall. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the sky's still up there. It hasn't fallen. It is maybe human nature for some to say this is terrible, but what if this actually moved the ball forward?
How?
And that's what the American people...
Madam Secretary, you keep saying that, and I still don't see how it moves the ball forward. In terms of the peace process, all the president has done, is remove something from the table that could have been used to either force the Israelis to concede something or force the Palestinians to concede something.
Because we've had conversations with both the Palestinians and the Israelis. We've had great negotiations in that respect, and we're going to continue doing that. And, for those who want to say this is a bad idea, I'll tell you, ask us 5 and 10 years from now if you still think it's a bad idea, because I really do think that this is going to move the ball in the peace process. And what this does is just say what's real. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. What's wrong with saying it?
What about
the
East
American
Jerusalem?
people have agreed with that.
But what about East Jerusalem?
We did not talk about boundaries or borders for a reason, and that's because whatever is East Jerusalem or any other part, that's between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's not for the Americans to decide. The Americans just said we want our embassy in the capital, and that capital is Jerusalem.
I still don't see how it moves the peace process forward, but I do want to get to know...
That's okay. It will move the peace process forward, and I'll come back and tell you I told you so.
Okay, well, I await that booking. Let's turn to North Korea, though. President Trump spoke about diplomatic efforts in North Korea Friday night at a rally in Florida. Take a listen to what he had to say.
As part of a campaign of maximum pressure on the vile dictatorship of North Korea, we have imposed the toughest ever sanctions passed by the United Nations Security Council. And we have a lot of other sanctions. But, I don't know that sanctions are going to work with him. We got to give it a shot. We'll see.
Just days ago, North Korea launched an ICBM that theoretically could hit the continental U.S. You and President Trump keep talking about these toughest ever sanctions. But with all due respect, it doesn't seem to be making any difference in North Korea's behavior. Is there any evidence at all that this approach is working?
Well, I think you have to look at what did the sanctions do. They cut off 90% of the trade, 30% of the oil, but every ounce of revenue that North Korea receives, they put towards their nuclear program. So the fact that the sanctions have completely squeezed them, that's less money they can put towards that nuclear program now. So whether people can't see it, it is helping us tremendously to not have them have the cash that they normally would have had. This is a serious situation. The missile that they launched not too long ago was much stronger than the one we had seen before. They have made progress. But what we have managed to do is the United States has led, and the international community is all with us in isolating North Korea. That's a very important move. They feel it. They're getting paranoid. They're stressed out about it. But we're going to continue to keep up the pressure because we have to.
Speaking of sanctions, back in August, the president signed a bill, kind of forced to sign it. That was a bill that passed overwhelmingly by Congress, sanctioning Russia for interfering in the 2016 election. It's now December, and those sanctions have yet to be implemented. Why is President Trump, why is the Trump administration dragging its feet and delaying these sanctions against Russia for the election interference?
Well, from what I've been told, the State Department says they have gone forward with the sanctions on Russia. And so, I don't know anything about what you're talking about because the State Department has said they have fully implemented that.
President Trump attended the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum on Saturday after two prominent black congressmen, including civil rights leader John Lewis, said they would not be attending because of President Trump's presence. In a statement, they wrote, quote, "President Trump's attendance and his hurtful policies are an insult to the people portrayed in this civil rights museum," unquote. Now, I know you're the UN ambassador, but before that, you were also a South Carolina governor, and you were there during an important moment for the country and for South Carolina when it came to racial healing and reconciliation. Do you think President Trump should do more beyond simply attending a museum opening to show that he actually stands for and believes in the values of the civil rights movement?
Well, I can tell you this. The idea of race is a very sensitive one, and racial issues are extremely we have to be very careful with racial issues because they're personal. What I do believe is we all have to continue to work to improve race relations. That's something that we all want as Americans. I think the president made a first step really trying to go out there to recognize the civil rights that people fought for, to look at this museum and to try and really reach out. I wish they would have joined him in that, but that's something that we just have to continue to do. We have to continue to bring both sides together and say, how are we going to heal? How are we going to move forward?
Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. If I don't see you, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas, Jake. Thank you.
New attempts by Russian operatives to infiltrate President Trump's inner circle even after the 2016 election. It got to the point where the FBI stepped in. The top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee investigating Russia is here to discuss that next. Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. Russian operatives made repeated attempts during the presidential transition to contact a senior advisor to the president, according to a new report in the New York Times. The report says that FBI officials warned Hope Hicks earlier this year about the Russian outreach, saying that two Russian operatives had contacted her by email. The new reporting shows yet another example of Russian attempts to infiltrate President Trump's inner circle, even after the 2016 election. Here with me to talk about this and much more, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. I want to start with this new report about Russian efforts to contact Hope Hicks. What do you make of this continued effort to permeate President Trump's inner circle?
Well, without getting the specifics of that allegation, we do know that the Russians throughout the campaign were making outreach to the campaign. They continue that during the transition, including some of the people they had talked to during the campaign, and obviously even after that point. So this is part of a concerted Russian influence operation that never stopped. We've also seen a lot of what we saw during the campaign in terms of Russian social media intervention never stop. The only issue I took when James Comey testified that the Russians will be back is they've never left in terms of certain parts of their active measures campaign, but it's not at all a surprise that they would make outreach to people they thought would have influence in the administration and misrepresent who they were and what their agenda was.
Does this report at all undermined the idea that the Russians had already established close contacts within the Trump inner circle. I mean, if they already had done that, why bother reaching out to HOPEX?
Well, the Russian tradecraft is to try to find as many entrees as they can to make influence over foreign governments. So even though they had good contacts within the administration, and probably none better than Mike Flynn, they were seeking other avenues, other ways to exert influence. And I think we've seen that as part of a broad pattern, some which I can't get into here today. But that is very much consistent with Russian tradecraft.
So you said earlier this week about the Russia investigation, quote, you really have to be trying to look away to say there's no evidence of collusion here. Now, as far as the public knows, we've seen evidence of Russian hacking, according to the intelligence community. We've seen the Russians dangling these emails, these damaging emails, before contacts with the Trump team or members of the Trump team. And we've seen members of the Trump team expressing willingness to get dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russians. But we haven't seen the actual connection. We haven't seen an actual proof of cooperation and collusion. So what am I missing here?
Well, you know, I think you have to look at the pattern and the chronology. You have in late April the Russians approaching the Trump campaign and saying, we have stolen Hillary Clinton emails. You have only weeks later the Russians making another approach to the campaign, this time at the highest levels, offering dirt on Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
The campaign already on notice that they have emails. You then have the message going back from the campaign to the Russians, basically, we would love to have your help, we'd love to play ball, but we are really disappointed in what you gave us. And only days later, Julian Assange announces he's received stolen emails, which we know now came from the Russians, and the Russians themselves start publishing the emails through these cutouts. You then have Trump Jr. in private secret communication with WikiLeaks. So we have all of these facts in chronology. You'd have to believe that these were all isolated incidents, not connected to each other. Just doesn't make rational sense. Now, can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt, will be Mueller's question to answer, that the Russians communicated to the campaign that the way they were going to deliver the help they offered and that the campaign accepted was not by handing the emails directly over to the campaign, but by publishing them. That will be up to Mueller, and we continue to try to fill in all of the missing pieces. But we do know this. The Russians offered help, the campaign accepted help. The Russians gave help, and the president made full use of that help. And that is pretty damning, whether it is proof beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy or not.
Do you know of any instance where the Russians said, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it through WikiLeaks, we're going to do it through DC Leaks, this is how we're going to get this information out there?
I can't comment. That is an issue that we have been investigating, and I don't want to comment at this point or not what the state of that evidence is.
I want to ask you about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. He removed an FBI agent over the summer from his team after text messages that this agent sent reportedly revealed an anti-Trump bias. Another top member of Mueller's team's investigators, Andrew Weissman, sent an email to Sally Yates, then the acting attorney general, congratulating her for refusing to enforce the Trump travel ban. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Weissman also attended Hillary Clinton's election night party in New York. Can you understand, if the situations were reversed, why Republicans would look at these facts and say, boy, there might really be a problem with bias in the Mueller investigation?
You know, Jake, the fact is the circumstances have been reversed in probably a far more significant way, and that is we now know that at the same time that James Comey was openly talking about a Hillary Clinton investigation, including up until days before the election, he was not disclosing to the public that there was also an investigation of the Trump campaign. That is far more significant than any of these text messages from my point of view. Now, I don't think that was because James Comey had a political axe to grind and was doing this in a partisan way. I do think it was an error in judgment. And I think it is perfectly appropriate for us to do oversight of how that investigation was conducted. But the intent here is not to do oversight. The intent here is nothing short of discrediting Mueller, then discrediting the Justice Department, then discrediting the FBI, then discrediting the judiciary. Should the judiciary convict some of the people that Mueller has charged or may charge in the future? This is an effort to tear at the very idea that there is an objective truth. And I think this president, in astonishing speed, has remade the Republican Party in his own deeply flawed image. And that will be ruinous to the Republican Party. But as we depend on a two-party system with two functional parties, it will also be deeply damaging to the country. The discrediting of our institutions, the justice system, the judiciary, the press, is enormously destructive.
Congressman Adam Schiff, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. If I don't see you before Tuesday, happy Hanukkah and happy New Year to you, sir.
And to you as well.
President Obama has a stark warning for Americans. Stay vigilant or risk a similar path to that of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. That story's next.
Now, presumably there was a ballroom here in Vienna in the late 1920s or 30s that looked pretty sophisticated with the music and the art and the literature and the science that was emerging. It would continue into perpetuity. And then 60 million people died. And an entire world was plunged into chaos. So, you got to pay attention and vote.
As President Obama, former President Obama, seemingly warning people that they need to stay engaged, need to stay pay attention, otherwise Nazi Germany could happen. I'm here with my panel. Amanda, kind of a stark example for President Obama to cite, and I know some conservatives are offended by it. What do you think?
I think history is rich with examples of disgraceful leadership, and this is a form of intellectual laziness that I don't expect from President Obama. If you want to draw a historical analogy, I'd probably stick to Watergate and the bumbling thugs that helped Nixon carry that out. But if he does want to draw on history, I mean, let's not descend into Godwin's law from a former president. He could do better.
What do you think?
The president's main message was we have to tend, I think his exact words were, we have to tend to the garden of democracy. That was really his point. And he can use any example that he chooses. The bottom line is that he's talking about consciousness within society that we can never lose sight of, that we must continue to fight for our higher selves. And that was mainly his point, that we can dissipate to the ugly side of humanity if we are not careful.
Mark?
I hope he's not referring to his political opponents and comparing them with Nazi Germany, and I'm going to hope for the best in that. But really, we've got to learn to disagree without being disagreeable again as Americans, and we can disagree with people on policy. We don't have to be disagreeable or consider them our enemies.
Bakari?
I think that we have to look at what happened next, what he said next, because after this, he still talked about the fact that from the United States is an emerging narrative that the rest of the world still looks up to. He talked about the rule of law. He talked about order. He talked about the intellect and the science and the technology and all of these emerging things that are coming from the United States of America. But there are a lot of us who are concerned about the fact that the norms, the fundamental norms of democracy, the fundamental tenets of our democracy are being preyed upon daily by this administration, and people who are neglectful and don't want to look at that in the eye are just being naive or dishonest. And so it may have been an interesting example. It may have been one that people want to shy away from. However, it's not ahistorical. It doesn't lack any fact. In fact, it's very much true.
Speaking of societal norms, let's turn to the Alabama Senate race and Roy Moore. A very important part of whether or not Doug Jones can pull this off will be if he can turn out the black vote in Alabama. The African-American population there makes up about 27% of Alabama. An article in the Washington Post said in order to win the black vote there, Jones is going to need to win the black vote at a rate close to Barack Obama. Do you think that Doug Jones can pull this off, Bakari? It seems like a pretty tall order.
About 2 weeks ago, I would have told you no. Now I'm in the category firmly believing that Doug Jones can win this race. It is an extremely tall order because the BVAP, the black voting age population, at the end of this race has to be about 27%. The polls that have him up 2 to 3% have it at about 23, 25%. The polls that have him down have it at about 17%. I don't know how many people at this table or watching today have actually voted in December. I've never voted in December. I mean, it's very atypical to vote in December, and it's a very difficult time. But I can tell you this, that we've spent a lot of time on CNN and every other network talking about Roy Moore. But Doug Jones is in Alabama talking about Doug Jones. He's talking about rebuilding hospitals that are falling apart. He's talking about jobs in the black belt. He's encouraging African Americans to come out and vote. And it's going to be a tough haul. But on Tuesday, we're talking about Alabama, and Alabama's going to be a close race.
Mark, President Trump is a lot of Republicans disagree with his decision to back Roy Moore. You heard Richard Shelby, the senior senator from Alabama, earlier in the show say he didn't vote for Roy Moore. He believes the women who have charged and made allegations against Roy Moore. What is the reason beyond pure partisan politics keeping that seat Republican to support somebody who is so controversial and has had so many credible charges against him?
Well, I think you heard Senator Shelby say it as well. He did not vote for the Democrat. He wants to see a Republican in that seat.
Just not that Republican.
Right. And that's the way he phrased that. And I think that's what you've seen the president say and a lot of others is that this seat is important and we need someone representing Alabama, and ultimately Alabama will decide who they believe better represents their policy positions in Washington, D.C., whether that is Judge Moore or whether that is Doug Jones, and we'll find out.
The president's gone a lot farther than that, though, to be honest. I mean, the president's out there saying vote for him. That's not what Richard Shelby said.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, Richard Shelby wouldn't even say who he wrote in as a candidate. I mean, how can you mount any kind of opposition to Roy Moore if Richard Shelby will not say who he voted for? But what I think is interesting about this race is that you are seeing the power of the presidency. They've done an effective job at keeping Roy Moore quiet and sending in the big guns, which are now President Trump and Steve Bannon. And President Trump is formulating a strong 2020 generic argument against the Democrats. He's said repeatedly in interviews that the Democrats, pick any one of them, whether it's Doug Jones or anybody else, are bad on immigration, bad for the military, bad on spending, will raise your taxes. He has got his playbook down, and that's a very convincing argument for Alabama voters.
What do you think? I mean, do you think that the Democrats can actually pull this off? Over the weekend, several prominent African-American politicians, Democrats, Kamala Harris from California, Cory Booker from New Jersey, Deval Patrick, formerly the governor of Massachusetts, hit the trail for Jones. Can that make a difference?
I mean, we're giving it a try, and all politicians bring in the big folks, so to speak. But this really comes down to how you cultivate a relationship with voters over the long haul. Democrats tend to shy away from red states purely for political reasons, and hopefully we're learning now that we definitely need a 50-state strategy, and that strategy has to be year after year after year, and not just when we get in a situation like this. And then further, for Democrats to always have to balance whether they win or lose on the backs of African Americans is particularly troubling to me. It is crack the glass or break the glass in case of emergency. Now, we do have a real emergency now, but I think the party can go a long way, especially the national party, in cultivate and building the state parties every single year so that when we have situations like this, you've already built a strong relationship with the voters that you're asking to come out to vote and not have to try to rally or push people out last minute.
Mark, do you not understand why Republicans like Cory Gardner, the senator from Colorado, think that Roy Moore ultimately, even if it keeps that seat, even if he wins and that seat is kept in Republican hands, that it actually will do damage to the Republican brand?
Many people have said these are very troubling allegations, and many asked Judge Moore to leave the race right after they first surfaced. He did not do so, which really there's nothing that we can do to force him to be able to do that. But what we're seeing is really playing out on a policy level for all of the voters in Alabama, and we're seeing it in that if you can't have a candidate that's going to win enough votes that you can take a very difficult situation in this case, you've got to work on your overall message and strategy.
But that's fundamentally the problem with this country right now. Mark just highlighted it, and I'm not even sure he realized he highlighted it, because Republicans right now, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, everyone else from top down, are putting policy over the moral fabric of our country. Like, what does the Republican Party stand for? Even more specifically, what do white evangelicals in the South and probably throughout this country stand for, that you can turn a blind eye to someone who's charged credibly with pedophilia, charged credibly with preying on children, that you say, oh my God, I'd rather have a vote for a tax cut than somebody who is actually a good person? And to Nina's point, one of the things that Doug Jones has going for him, there's been no clearer dichotomy of any election that we've had in recent history. You have someone who literally imprisoned Eric Rudolph. You have someone who actually imprisoned the people who bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, versus someone who, thinks that slavery was a good time period for African Americans and all of us, and someone who, as Ivanka Trump said, is the worst part of America because they prey on children. I would ask you to rethink your position, or have your party rethink their position on whether or not it's policy or what we want the moral fiber of our country to be. That's a problem for me.
Amanda, you're a Republican who's been struggling with this Trump era, especially when it comes to the standards of personal behavior. What's your take on the idea that the Republican Party is so set on achieving its policy goals, it's willing to look away, and ignore serious charges, as Bakari just said? Do you agree with his take?
I don't agree with all of it. I agree with some of it. There's a lot of Republicans, friends of mine, who have made the decision that the politics are so toxic and damaged right now, we will take a flawed actor in office if they are a means of achieving the policy goals that we want. And honestly, I can't look at a Republican voter who says abortion is my #1 voting issue. and tell them to vote for a Democrat who is pro-choice and will support abortion at 20 weeks or more. If that is their highest voting issue, which it is to many Republicans, who will go with a Roy Moore knowing that he is a flawed candidate because they deeply care about that issue. And so my anger and my frustration is faced towards Republican Party leaders who don't give us better choices. The Republican Party in Alabama had mechanisms to change the race, to change the election. Would have been drastic. Would there have been people that would have been upset? Yes. But they had the means to do it, just as Republicans did at the convention, to at least have a roll call vote to voice opposition to Donald Trump, and they didn't do it. So my anger is at the leaders in the Republican Party that create these conditions, not the voters that have to grapple with them.
All right, thanks one and all for being here. Chuck and Nancy, Roy Moore, Vladimir Putin. Who's on the president's nice list this year, and who's been naughty? It's complicated. That's the subject of this week's State of the Cartoonian, coming up next. Welcome back. With just 15 days until Christmas, there is not much time left to get on Santa's good side. But Santa Claus, he's not the only one with a naughty or nice list, and that's the subject of this week's State of the Cartoonian.
He's making a list and he's checking it twice. But for Santa Trump, determining who's naughty or nice, that's complicated. Take Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, who's been accused of sexually abusing at least 2 teenagers. Now that might land him on Santa Claus's naughty list, but Santa Trump?
He totally denies it. He says it didn't happen, and, you know, you have to listen to him also.
Okay, so Moore is denying it, but what about a man who admits to things like murder? Say, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. Well, he's also in Santa Trump's nice column.
We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful.
And speaking of human rights abuses, what about the big guy himself, Vladimir Putin?
President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well.
Okay, that's the nice list. But don't bother checking your stocking if you've been naughty.
They're filled with West Virginia coal.
Starting with 2 former pals.
I think the losers are Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
Lumps of coal for Chuck and Nancy. Santa Trump also thinks that former FBI Director James Comey has been naughty. Comey probably has the president on a list of his own.
Director Comey was very unpopular with most people.
And 1 year later, the person who still is #1 on the Trump naughty list.
If Hillary runs again in 4 years, which I hope she does, we're going to teach her unbelievably nasty, really nasty.
This Sunday, Roy Moore, the Senate, and what's at stake in Alabama. President Trump makes it clear he's all in for Moore.
Get out and vote for Roy Moore.
Meet the Press headed down to Alabama, where accusations of sexual misconduct against Moore are the issue.
It's something nobody is comfortable with. You know, nobody.
I think all it was a woman scoring.
Democrat Doug Jones has a real chance. But could a Moore win actually damage the Republican Party in the long run? My guests this morning, Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and Progressive Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Plus, sexual misconduct charges take down 3 more members of Congress amid whispers that dozens more may soon be implicated. And the effort by conservatives to undermine Robert Mueller's Russia investigation.
Mueller is corrupt. The senior FBI is corrupt. The system is corrupt.
The Mueller investigation is illegitimate and corrupt.
While Donald Trump Jr. tries to assert attorney-client privilege to keep quiet about a key conversation with the president. Neither are lawyers. I'll talk to House Intelligence Committee member who questioned Trump Jr. this week, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Joining me for insight and analysis are NBC News Chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson, David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, Peggy Noonan, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Democratic pollster and NBC News political analyst Cornell Belcher. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning. It's possible to make too much of any one Senate race, but it's hard to overstate how much is at stake in Alabama on Tuesday. There's the Senate. A win by Doug Jones would give the Democrats 49 seats, and more importantly for them, a realistic chance of winning the majority in 2018. There's the president's agenda. Whether it's taxes or the budget or the courts, with one less vote, Senate Republicans will have an even harder time getting anything passed in that chamber. There's the sexual harassment issue. This election may tell us if categorically denying all accusations, no matter how credible, as Republican Roy Moore has done, is a successful strategy. And then there's the Republican Party itself. If Moore wins, will the GOP be happy to have his vote, or worry that the Democrats will hang Moore and his daily antics around the necks of Republican candidates throughout 2018? On Friday, I traveled to Mobile in deep red Alabama, which has voted for a Democratic presidential nominee exactly once since 1960. And what I found was widespread discomfort among voters in this conservative state, faced with choosing between a Democrat and a Republican accused of molesting underage girls.
Senate election, the candidates are hitting the campaign trail hard.
With 2 days to go in Alabama, politics is the only story.
Get out and vote for Roy Moore.
60 miles from where President Trump campaigned for Roy Moore on Friday night, voters across the state line in Mobile are getting used to being the center of attention.
I have never seen as many yard signs for a Democrat in my life as in coastal Alabama.
There are a lot of Doug Jones signs around Fairhope. There are probably plenty of people voting for Roy Moore, but they just don't want to put a sign in their yard.
At a fundraiser for the Mobile Bay watershed on Friday night, I talked to some of the suburban women Jones hopes to win over. The multiple allegations against Moore of sexual misconduct with teenage girls aren't sitting well.
I mean, this is a terrible thing.
Campaign strategist Dean Young defends Moore.
Judge Moore did know some of the accusers. At least he said that at first, and now claims he didn't know any of the accusers.
Judge Moore knows people all over this country and all over Alabama. When you ask somebody, do you know this person?
So he doesn't remember people he dated?
No, well, again, it goes
I remember
back to
everybody I've dated.
Well, we know this. Judge Moore doesn't.
Do you remember everybody you dated?
No, I don't.
Many Alabama voters still don't know what to make of the allegations.
I need some kind of proof other than word of mouth that it happened.
Elaine Williams is a Class A welder at the Austell Shipyards, which employs 4,000 workers, building combat ships for the U.S. Navy.
They said the same thing about Trump. He still made office.
For a lot of people, that's a private matter that they just don't talk about it.
At Winsel's Oyster House on Dauphin Street, oysters come fried, stewed, and nude. And Mobile is the kind of place with moderate and African-American voters where Democrat Doug Jones needs to overperform. Does Doug Jones have a message beyond being not Roy Moore?
He demonstrated courage in 2001, 2002, when he went back nearly 40 years and got people who had been involved in the killing of the murdering of those 4 little black girls in Birmingham.
In order to distract from his issues, Moore's campaign continues to seize on this abortion answer from Jones when the general election began.
You wouldn't be in favor of legislation that said ban abortion after 20 weeks or something like that?
Now, I'm not in favor of anything that is going to infringe on a woman's right and her freedom to choose.
And Moore needs to turn out Trump voters like Flo Wiggum.
I think all it was a woman scored. They didn't get his attention, marry him, whatever.
What do you think is going to happen Tuesday?
I have no idea. I have no idea what's going to happen on Tuesday.
I think it's going to be really freaking close.
Joining me now is Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Senator Scott, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Thank you, Chuck. Welcome back from the South.
Yeah, it's always good to be there. Hey, I'm from Miami, though. We're so far south, we're north, as the joke goes. You called for Roy Moore to move on. A couple of weeks ago, you said you're not quite sure what you want to see the White House do. I had a spokesperson for the White House come on this show and essentially say, you know what, there is no Senate seat that is worth electing somebody accused of child molestation. But now the president has turned and he's all in for Roy Moore. Are you comfortable that the leader of your party is all in for Roy Moore?
Well, there are a number of people in my party that are not, including myself and many Republican senators. The NRSC has not re-engaged in that race. So the fact of the matter is our party is big enough to have disagreements from the top to where we are, and we'll continue to work for ways to move this country forward by looking at the issues and the policies that will improve the quality of life of the average American. But within the party, there's going to be disagreements, and obviously we're seeing one right now.
All right. Roy Moore's, if he wins, you referenced the NRSC, the head of that campaign committee, Cory Gardner of Colorado, your colleague there, is for expulsion. He wants to see an ethics committee and eventually perhaps a vote on expulsion. Where are you on this?
I think the Constitution requires us to, A, if he wins, and still an if he wins, we have to seat him. Then there will immediately be an ethics investigation. We'll have a greater opportunity for us to look into all the issues, the allegations, and perhaps even talk with some of the folks who are witnesses. That will give us a clear picture. I've always said that so far as I can tell, the allegations are significantly stronger than the denial. And I'm going to let my decision be made by the breadth of information and evidence that I'm able to review during that process.
I want to, there's a few campaign elements being used here. Doug Jones is trying to fire up African-American voters. And he has this mailer out, and I know you don't have a TV screen in front of you, but I'm going to describe it to you.
I do not.
It's an African-American male with a skeptical look on his face, big picture, and it says this: think if a black man went after high school girls, anyone would try to make him a senator. What do you think of that kind of campaign literature?
Well, it's getting lower. It's getting closer to the gutter, honestly. I think a bigger issue is when you bifurcate the current issue between those who believe Roy Moore and those who do not. That is perhaps a more telling, significant sign. 71% in a recent poll of Republican voters, likely voters, say that they do not believe the allegations. So really a bigger question, other than the question that you just presented to me, is how many voters believe the allegations and how many do not? And when you split that, you find a very telling story.
You know, there's been some concern that the election of Roy Moore is just going to send a larger negative message about what the Republican Party stands for. You have been somebody as a leader in the party to try to talk about inclusion. I wonder if comments like this that Roy Moore said when he was revering the age of slavery, when he said, I think it was a great time in America at the time when families were united, even though we had slavery, they cared for one another, people were strong in their families. And then I thought about that quote and this tweet from Steve King earlier this week. And he says this: diversity is not our strength. And then he quotes Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, quote, mixing cultures will not lead to a higher quality of life, but a lower one. This stuff inside your party. Look, Senator Scott, I know you don't want to associate yourself with that, but it's associated with the Republican Party. What do you do about this?
Well, very little that I can do about people who speak ignorantly, and you just have to call it for what it is, number one. Number two, the bottom line is both when Steve King and Tim Scott arrived in this country, we were actually creating diversity because the Native Americans were already here. So that is just a ridiculous statement. Roy Moore's, listen, I wasn't supporting Roy Moore before the allegations. The allegations reinforced why I wasn't there. The good news is, thank God for leaders like John Ratcliffe, Trey Gowdy, Mia Love, a diverse group of young thinkers who will take our country and our party in a better direction.
I want to ask you about what happened in the United States Senate this week. One of your colleagues announced his resignation. Let me play a little clip of what Senator Franken said during that speech.
Irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
First of all, do you think it was appropriate for Senator Franken to resign?
Well, I think Senator Franken thought it was important and very important for him to resign, number one. Number two, I will tell you that there's no question that his statement was inconsistent with reality. The truth is that there are a number of people within the party who are not supporting Roy Moore.
Would you, though, talk about what he said about the president? At some point, given this moment we're in, should the president's accusers deserve time to sort of, in a formal setting, lay out their accusations and have them sort of, and let people judge for themselves?
I think people have had the opportunity during the 2016 election to come to a decision. The truth is, as you and I both know, Chuck, that the allegations or the accusations against the president were a part of the campaign. So most Americans, if not all Americans who voted, had the information before the election. So for us to try to relitigate the election is impossible. should people who have been victimized have an opportunity to have their day in court or their day presenting their information, I have no problem with that issue.
And yet, if Roy Moore gets elected, you are going to potentially have another investigation into this via the United States Senate. There is no place to have another investigation outside of Congress about the president and his accusers.
No question.
And is that something that should change? Should you guys be looking at the president's accusers as well?
Once again, I think there are two very different scenarios here. One, the Senate has responsibility and oversight over our members. I believe that if he wins, we're going to exercise that responsibility. The people of this country have the responsibility of choosing our president they have chosen.
Yeah. Let me ask you this about the tax bill. You've been chosen to be on the conference committee. That one of the biggest disputes that some have to do with this idea of writing off state and local taxes. Let me ask you this philosophically. Yes. Why is it that corporations are going to be able to write off state and local taxes, but not individuals? Do you see where the fairness argument in that sort of gets traction?
I think the question about writing off ordinary business expenses versus writing off state and local taxes are two very different questions. One has to do with businesses. The other has to do with how we treat high tax states like New York, New Jersey, and do we allow other Americans in South Carolina and North Carolina to subsidize those high taxes? What I'll tell you is that we are looking at ways to sweeten the salt solution. So we have challenges without any question. So we're going to sweeten that solution for salt. I tried hard on it.
What is that? I see that. What does that mean, though, when you say sweeten? Expand the deduction a little bit, or what does that mean?
There's a lot of conversation around the fact that in some of the blue states where the taxes are high, the property tax alone will not be able to use the $10,000 possible deduction. So allowing for income and property taxes, which would cost another $100 billion, by the way, to be options for folks in those states would be a better solution. And we're looking at ways to make that happen.
Does that mean you'll raise the corporate rate from 20%?
I'm hoping that we don't have to. We're looking at things that the two bodies have very different approaches to mortgage interest deduction, which would save us about $25 billion that we could use to provide more relief to the salt, or my sweetener in the salt, should I say.
All right. Well, sweet and savory is the type of cuisine these days that everybody seems to love. So maybe you guys will figure that out there. Senator Scott, appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your views. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Chuck. Have a good day.
Joining me now from the other side of the aisle, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. He is, of course, the independent who caucuses with the Democrats. Senator Sanders, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
Let me start with the issue of taxes here, since we just ended that with Senator Scott. I know you're not a fan of this bill at all, okay? I know where you believe the priorities are all wrong. But what should the has the Democratic Party collectively done enough, you think, in the institutions of the House and the Senate to stop this bill?
Well, one of the absurdities of this whole process is the Republicans made a decision to go forward without any Democratic Party input. What they made a decision to do is to operate behind closed doors on an issue that impacts every single American. There was not one public hearing. What this tax bill is about is nothing more than a gift to billionaire campaign contributors to the Republican Party. You have 62% of all of the tax benefits going to the top 1%, 40% going to the top 1/10 of 1%. At the end of 10 years, 83 million American middle-class taxpayers will be paying even more in taxes. 13 million people will lose their health insurance, and they're going to run up a deficit of $1.4 trillion. This is not a tax bill designed to help the American people. It is a tax bill designed to help the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations, and I'm going to do everything I can to see that it is defeated.
I understand that, but what's realistic? I mean, you don't have the votes? Is it trying to find one more Republican, or where are you in this?
Right. It's not true. Senator Corker has made it clear that it's absurd that we would run up a deficit of $1.4 trillion. He's right. There are other senators. Senator Rubio has his concern. McCain has his concerns. Collins has her concerns. I would hope that the American people would say that at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, where the top 1/10 of 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, why would we be giving massive tax breaks to people who don't need it and then cut back on programs that middle-class people do need? Now, by the way, one of the ugly aspects of this, Chuck, is, as you well know now, what Paul Ryan is saying is, oh my goodness, if the deficit goes up by $1.4 trillion as a result of this tax bill, we're going to have to cut back and cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs. Tax breaks for billionaires, cuts to Social Security. That is grossly unfair. And please remember what Donald Trump said in his campaign. He said, I will not support cuts to Social Security. President Trump, keep your word. Veto that legislation.
I believe you bring a poster board of that tweet or quote down to the Senate floor almost weekly, for what it's worth. I want to move on to what happened to one of your colleagues this week when Al Franken decided to resign. I want to play for you something that was sort of a common refrain among quite a few conservatives. Here's Newt Gingrich.
And what you saw today was a lynch mob. Let's not have due process. Let's not ask anybody any questions. Let's not have any chance to have a hearing. Let's just lynch him.
Al Franken wanted the Ethics Committee to take a look first before he made any decisions. Bob Menendez is in the midst of an Ethics Committee probe. Why should Bob Menendez be given time in front of the Ethics Committee before you guys as Democrats decide his fate versus Al Franken?
Well, Bob Menendez, as you know, underwent a lengthy trial. There was a hung jury. He was not convicted of anything. I think
could be retried. He may be retried, for what it's worth.
Well, he may be, but that's where we are today. I think in terms of Al Franken, what you have, and Al Franken is a friend of mine and I think has been a very good senator for Minnesota. But what you have is a situation where Senator Franken acknowledged wrongdoing on several occasions, inappropriate behavior, and he felt that the appropriate thing to do was to offer his resignation. I think what the absurdity is...
He didn't think, I'll be honest with you, Senator, he didn't sound like somebody who thought it was appropriate. He sounded like somebody who was being forced to resign. He wasn't being forced.
Well, I don't know that you know what was in Al Franken's mind, but the point is that we have the absurdity now of a president of the United States who basically says on a tape that everybody in this country has seen his pride, in a sense, in assaulting women. And he has not apologized for that, and he has, not offered his resignation. So I think that's the absurdity. But I think in terms of what Gingrich was saying, there needs to be a due process. There needs to be a differentiation between somebody who pats somebody on the backside and somebody who commits terrible acts against women. And furthermore, what we need in this country, and this whole discussion is bringing this up, we need a cultural revolution. Because it's not just famous people who are harassing women. There are people all over this country, women who are working in restaurants, who are being harassed every single day. We need to change the culture of how we treat women on the job.
I want to ask you about the issue of impeachment. Here is Tom Steyer. He's a billionaire activist, may run for the U.S. Senate himself in California. He's been running these ads nationwide. Let me play a clip.
He's brought us to the brink of nuclear war, obstructed justice at the FBI, and in direct violation of the Constitution, he's taken money from foreign governments and threatened to shut down news organizations that report the truth. If that isn't a case for impeaching and removing a dangerous president, then what has our government become?
Look, you just established you want him to resign. But the
no,
U.S.
what I
Congress,
just said, what I just, Chuck, what I just said is Al Franken felt it proper for him to resign. Here you have a president who has been accused by many women of assault, who says on a tape that he assaulted women. He might want to think about doing the same.
All right, no, but understandable. But let me go to this impeachment question here. Is Tom Steyer right that it's time to look at that option? There was already a House vote this week. Many Democrats weren't ready to get on that bandwagon yet. Where are you on this issue?
I think there is a process that has to be followed. I think Mr. Mueller is doing a very good job on his investigation. And if Mueller brings forth the clear evidence that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, I think you have grounds for impeachment. But I think jumping the gun does nobody any good. You have to bring the American people onto this issue. You don't want to make it into a partisan issue. If we're going to go forward with impeachment, I want the American people clearly to understand why that is the case, why it makes sense, why it's the right thing to do. I don't think we're there right now. That's what the Mueller investigation is all about. And by the way, I am deeply offended by Republican efforts to try to discredit Mr. Mueller. When he was FBI director, he was a great guy. Now that he's doing his job here, Republicans don't like him. I think that's really very unfair.
That is an issue we are actually going to be diving into later in this show. Senator Sanders, as always, sir, thank you for coming on and sharing your views. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
When we come back, would Republicans actually be better off if Roy Moore loses? And later, as the Russia investigation moves closer to President Trump, as Senator Sanders sort of hinted at there, the president's allies are attacking Robert Mueller's legitimacy. Are they laying the groundwork for the president to fire the special counsel? Welcome back. Panelists here, David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, NBC News' chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson, Peggy Noonan, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Democratic pollster and NBC News political analyst Cornell Belcher. Welcome. I was just down in Alabama, and we saw Frank Luntz did a focus group for our friends over at Vice. I want to play a quick clip of it, because I think it actually encapsulates what I discovered as well. Take a listen.
How many of them do you think are being paid?
All of them.
All of them?
All of them.
By show of hands, how many of you think all the women are being paid? Seriously.
There you go, David Brooks. I mean, and I'll tell you, my sense is that it is the Republican who will never vote for Doug Jones who's got to decide whether it's worth voting.
Yeah, well, there you saw cynicism, distrust of the system, alienation. That's what's been driving populism on left and right. To me, the big thing about this race is politics really matters. We care a lot about politics, but there are things that matter more. The state of your soul, the quality of your faith, the state of your character, and what this race is about are those things less important than politics. And what a lot of people are doing are seeing the Republican Party saying, yeah, politics comes before your faith and your character, and a lot of people are appalled.
But that's the point. That is what the president has made clear, that the seat, the politics of it, the votes from Roy Moore, if he ends up getting elected, are more important than these allegations against him. I talked with a senior administration official just this weekend who said, we don't know what's going to happen in this race because the data is totally screwed up. People aren't telling the truth in these polls. Yeah, you can't trust that. But the bottom line is when it comes to these allegations against Roy Moore, if he ends up in the Senate, you asked Tim Scott about it, they can't vote to expel him because the people knew before they voted about these allegations, and that is the distinction with Al Franken when it's information that's coming out after you've been seated.
You know, when I hear people talk about populism here, I know it's tribalism, right? And all Roy Moore has to do is be their tribal warrior, and they will excuse everything else that's going on. And particularly when you're talking about a place like Alabama, I think Alabama's at a pivotal place. We can talk about a lot of the issues there on the ground, but Alabama right now, the world is watching to a state that is trying to rebrand itself and trying to become a manufacturing and technology hub. The world is watching. Are you going to be a forward-thinking state that's going to attract Fortune 500 companies? You know, they were at a time Atlanta and Birmingham, you know this, were at the same place years ago, and Atlanta said we're too busy to hate, and became this cultural and economic center of the South.
That's a great point. Birmingham easily could be Atlanta today, Peggy, if it done that. But
Yes, that's going on in a big way, technologically, industrially, very sophisticated. I got to say, guys, in fairness, I'm very interested in Republican turnout in Alabama. If a number of people will think, I'm not a progressive, I can't vote in this direction, but I ain't going to support this guy. I think that will probably decide a lot.
Let me pause you here because that voter's looking for an extra piece of information about Roy Moore. And let me show you something that may have handed them that extra piece of information. Here's Gloria Allred from Friday.
But why not disclose in that initial news conference that those words were, written by her?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of other things that we have not disclosed which support Beverly, which we will disclose when there's a hearing.
There are voters, Peggy, that are looking for any thread to make them feel slightly more comfortable pulling the lever for Moore. And I had plenty that believe that Allred, the Gloria Allred client here, who has nothing to do with the Washington Post accusation, is enough?
The big Roy Moore allegation, the big story, is the original Washington Post story that began with the tale, completely credible, completely believable. The woman later came on it and did various interviews, I'm sure, here. It was a tale of being 14 years old and being preyed on by an older man in his 30s who shouldn't have been doing what he was doing. That was serious, important, and explosive. Then a person who makes a living getting publicity and money and such in high-profile cases comes, puts forward a case that looks a little less reliable, and that could give people a reason to say, they're always messing around with us. They're always screwing around in a dishonest way. Don't let them do it.
So that could be the tipping point that ends up putting Roy Moore in the Senate. And if he does, I spoke with a Republican strategist recently who said they are preparing for the ads to be used in October against their own people. But the other thing is, Peggy, I'm struck by something you said, the big Roy Moore story. Before this very big Roy Moore story, there were other big Roy Moore issues that had come up that his campaign to this day cannot answer, whether he believes homosexuality should be illegal, whether Muslims should serve in Congress. That was all happening in September.
And the best time of America was during slavery.
Yeah. David, I want to get to a point you made in your column on Friday, which is a victory by Roy Moore for the Republican Party is, I guess, the ultimate in a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it?
Right.
You think there's a long-term disaster?
You get a temporary vote for the Supreme Court justice for a tax cut, but for a generation, you're repulsive. You're repulsive to younger people. 28% of millennials think the Republican Party cares about them. That's just a generational problem. You're repulsive to people of color forever. And so you end up not only making yourself unpopular, but sort of corrupting a piece of yourself. To me, the interesting people in this whole deal are the honorable Republicans in Congress. The Portmans, the McCains, the Barrassos.
Tim Scott.
Yeah. And so he's, a couple of them have been very principled, but a lot of them have said, oh, yeah, I'm going to tolerate Trump's dishonesty. I'm going to tolerate some racial politics. But now they have to tolerate harassment. Now they have to tolerate pedophilia. There's no end to what they're going to be asked to tolerate, and that's just internally so corrosive.
Peggy, your conclusion in your column this week was sort of stay strong. If you've got your principles, don't forget them.
Yes, have faith. Not everything comes down to an immediate election that is this coming Thursday. Think long term. Philosophically, be true to your own political principles. But have some faith and don't make decisions that are not ones that you're really comfortable with. I just think that's the way to go on this. I believe, though, guys, in fairness, I don't think it's all shirts and skins, Team Red and Team Blue in Alabama. There are, for all Moore's eccentricities, we could, I'm sure, agree on that. For all his eccentricities, he represents a more conservative way of thinking about essential issues, including social issues such as abortion, which we've gotten into so much when we get to this. Jones is progressive for the state of Alabama, and there will be people who try to make serious decisions based on that. I agree with you that they still have to make a decision that is the right long-term one.
There's no doubt in my mind, that if Doug Jones were pro-life, like the governor, the Democratic governor of Louisiana, this race would already be over.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with all the latest on the Russia investigation, including what the president's allies are trying to do to end it. Welcome back. There was no shortage of news on the Russia investigation this week. President Trump's allies in Congress and on Fox News stepped up an effort to undermine independent counsel Robert Mueller, his investigation, and the credibility of the FBI. There was more evidence that WikiLeaks was at least playing favorites with the Trump campaign when it came to what they had in their servers. And in a closed-door hearing at the House Intelligence Committee, Donald Trump Jr. tried to claim attorney-client privilege to avoid describing his conversations with President Trump about his, Jr.'s, conversations last year with a Russian lawyer. By the way, neither Donald Trump Sr. or Jr. is a lawyer. It's quite a lot to unpack. So joining me now is a member of the House Intelligence Committee who actually had a chance to question Donald Trump Jr. It's Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Congressman, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thanks, Chuck.
Let me just start with, it was some 7 or 8 hours. Just characterize, would you characterize Donald Trump Jr. as forthcoming? You called him largely cooperative. Would you describe him that he was forthcoming?
Yeah, I would. I mean, he spent a lot of time in front of the committee. He answered questions. There was the one episode, which has been talked about since that interview, where he declined, and you made reference to it, he declined to answer a question about a conversation that he'd had with his father that may be relevant to the Don Jr. meeting at Trump Tower. Apart from that, I would say he was forthcoming.
When did he invoke this privilege? Was it a conversation that he had with his father in that right after the meeting itself, or was it about a conversation he may have had with his father about trying to spin the disclosure of the meeting?
Well, it's after the meeting, and of course, since we didn't get to hear what the content or substance of the meeting was, we don't know. But it was a sort of novel defense. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer myself, but every lawyer I know says that there is no attorney-client privilege when you're simply talking to somebody else with attorneys present. So we're going to need to get to the bottom of that.
What's interesting is if this were in a court of law, the judge would say, no, that's insufficient. You guys don't have that ability. If he's not going to answer, he's not going to answer. Was there any way of trying to force him to answer this question? Do you have any powers to compel him?
Well, sure. And I mean, this is the ultimate trump card, pardon the pun. Congress, in its investigations, does not need to acknowledge any privilege, right, including attorney-client privilege. Now, he was there voluntarily, and in the course of this investigation, the chairman, Mike Conaway, who's doing, by the way, a terrific and fair job, has said to witnesses that if you're here voluntarily, we're not going to compel testimony. So we may need to sort of subpoena him or get him back under a compulsory process.
Oh, is there a process to compel him to testify that isn't a subpoena?
There may be, but the point is he was there voluntarily, and so the rule had been if you're here voluntarily, we're not going to force you to answer questions.
All right. I know you guys had a lot of questions for him. I am curious to see, there'd always been this discussion about whether the president, when the meeting was disclosed, the president was on Air Force One on his first overseas trip, and there was some reporting that the president himself helped draft the initial statement by his son. Now, here's what the president's lawyer said to me in July on this issue.
The president was not involved in the drafting of the statement and did not issue the statement. It came from Donald Trump Jr. So that's what I can tell you, because that's what we know. And again, Donald Trump Jr. has said the same thing, that it was in fact from him.
Does that statement still hold up based on your questioning of Donald Trump Jr. the last?
Well, again, because of this sort of novel claim of privilege, we don't know what happened in that conversation.
So he used this privilege claim to just not describe any conversations he had with his father, period?
No, just this particular conversation. And again, why decide that you're not going to talk about that particular conversation? This is a prevailing theme in this investigation, right? There are things that are lied about up front, that are obfuscated, that are forgotten. And, you ask yourself if, why would he seek to protect that particular conversation? It obviously makes the investigators that much more curious about what the content was.
You've already, the Russian lawyer that was a part of this meeting has already testified in front of you, and she seemed to testify that all Donald Trump Jr. cared about was something, he wanted Clinton Foundation dirt, and when she couldn't provide it, she said he was uninterested. Did he confirm that account?
Well, we've actually gotten now, I think, 4 or 5 accounts of what happened in that room from 4 or 5 different people who were in that room. And the stories match up pretty consistently that, yes, Donald Trump Jr. was not particularly interested in adoptions. He wasn't particularly interested in the Magnitsky Act. He was interested, as he said himself in the email that he released, in finding out if there was dirt. So the question before us now is what happened afterwards? Was there follow-up? Was dirt conveyed in any way, shape, or form, and was it used? Because, of course, we've seen a lot of contact. We've seen a desire to get dirt, a desire to work with the Russians, a desire to contact the Russians. The question is, was there some form, and it is a question, I don't want to prejudice the outcome, was there cooperation?
Now, did the Russian lawyer admit that she was coming on behalf of the Russians to talk about sanctions?
Well, it's a little unclear exactly who was doing what to whom in that room. So, this Russian lawyer is a woman who has worked to reverse the Magnitsky Act for a long time. My sense is that that was her interest. Mr. Goldstone, who of course got this whole thing rolling, my sense is that he was the guy who injected this idea that there would be dirt, perhaps knowing that that would be interesting to people like Paul Manafort and Don Trump Jr. So we have yet to interview Rob Goldstone. Obviously, that's going to be an interesting interview.
Did anybody ask him why Donald Trump Jr. didn't go to the FBI when basically what appears to be the Russian government was trying to make contact with the campaign?
It did. The question got asked, and we got a similar answer to answers that we have gotten about other odd behavior. With Jared Kushner, it's now known that he'd had this conversation in which he sought a back channel, perhaps at the Russian embassy. Again, the question wasn't that odd? The answer we get on these situations is, hey, we were really, really busy, and I just thought, what the heck, we'll throw it out there and see. Don Jr., with respect to this information, was, it's not, as he put it, it's not illegal to listen. So, downplaying these things that to most eyes look pretty odd.
The scope of your investigation right now, Donald Trump Jr. Once talked about and almost bragged about how much Russian money was important to the real estate empire, and he said it back in 2008. The scope of your investigation when it comes to finances on the House side, how far back does it go?
Well, it only goes back to places like 2008 if a mention of Russia could point to cooperation with Russia in 2016. Look, Robert Mueller and others can look into, the kinds of things they looked into with Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort, of course, is charged with money laundering, with tax evasion, all sorts of things that are not obviously part of the congressional investigation. So the way I think about it is our job is really to figure out exactly what happened with the hack, the Russian attack on our election, whether there was cooperation, whether there were leaks associated with that. Criminal activity is very much more in the realm of what Bob Mueller is doing.
You just heaped praise on the acting Republican head of the House Intelligence Committee, the Arkansas Congressman Mike Conaway. Devin Nunes, who is the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, has been cleared of an ethics violation having to do with his actions here. Can he now, in your mind, unwind his recusal and take over the committee? Would you be comfortable with him chairing the House Intel Committee again?
Well, he always has chaired the committee. What he's done is he's stepped away from the investigation. To do that and to make me comfortable, I think Devin would have to sort of drop the role that he has played where he has decided, for example, to devote himself to the investigation of whether there was improper unmasking. We had a whole 702 reauthorization bill about surveillance in which there was a section about unmasking and how you have to report unmasking attempts during presidential transitions. That was a nakedly political thing. And sadly, and I like and respect Devin, but sadly in the last couple of months he has devoted himself to these things which I regard as distractions. Wiretapping of Trump Tower, is the FBI being forthcoming about the Steele dossier? I think he would need to drop all of those, what I regard as distractions, and come back in an impartial way, the way Mike Conaway has steered this investigation.
In fairness, you say that's impartial. Others would say you're the one that's not impartial. He's just trying to invoke the other aspects of this.
Well, so let's take the, first of all, I try to be pretty careful in the language I use. I'm not saying there was collusion. I'm an investigator. I want to make sure that there is impartiality. But look, let's talk for a second about this unmasking thing. I will tell you up front, I've looked at pretty much all of the intercepts that were unmasked and how they were done. Do I think that process can be better and sharper and more clearly defined? Absolutely. In fact, I would participate willingly in an effort to reform that. Was it used improperly by Sam Power or by Susan Rice? There is absolutely zero evidence that was the case.
Jim Hines, Democrat from Connecticut, on the House Intel Committee. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Chuck.
Appreciate it. When we come back, some signs that Republicans may want to start looking over their shoulders next November. Welcome back. Data download time. It's been a year since Donald Trump won the presidency and became leader of the Republican Party. And while President Trump's approval rating in that time has slumped, a lot has been made of his continued strength among Republican voters. But there is evidence that fewer people are actually calling themselves Republicans today than they did a year ago, which means that the president is holding on to a large share of a shrinking pie. According to Gallup, the percentage of people who now identify as Republicans has dropped 5 points since last November, 42% to 37%, while Democrats have remained flat at 44%. And Republicans have seen drops across nearly every demographic group. Let's start with age. Across 3 different age brackets, Republicans are down 4 or 5 points. The party is down 4 points among those with a college degree and 5 points among those without a college degree. But who is really driving the decline in people identifying as Republicans? It's women, particularly white women. Republicans are now down 5 points among all women. But more significantly, it's down 7 points among white women. In fact, last November, white women identified more as Republican than Democrat, 48-43. This November, those numbers are essentially reversed. 41% say they are Republicans, while 46% of white women now call themselves Democrats. So, Why do these numbers matter? Well, consider this. In the November Virginia governor's race, Republicans dropped 2 points in their party ID, and Democrats gained 4 from the 2013 election. The result? A race that was supposed to be a nail-biter turned into a rout for the Democrat. That happened in Virginia, and it doesn't stay in Virginia. The wave elections Democrats are hoping for across the country next year could actually happen. When we come back, some new reporting on the president's unique TV news watching habits.
Coming up, Endgame and Postgame. Brought to you by Boeing. Continuing our mission to connect, protect, explore, and inspire. Endgame. Brought to you by Boeing. Continuing our mission to connect, protect, explore, and inspire.
Back now with Endgame, I want to talk, Peggy, about the Franken standard, because we now have a new standard for resignation, you could argue, when it comes to Al Franken. Ruth Marcus, a familiar face to many here of the Washington Post, wrote this: "There's no doubt in the case of Al Franken, the Democrats are better off with the Minnesota senator gone. There's more doubt about whether justice was done. I agree, none of it is acceptable. What gives me pause is both the rush to judgment and the one-size-fits-all nature of the punishment."
Fair enough, but we had, this is a country trying to establish, it's certainly a U.S. Senate trying to establish new standards for acceptable behavior. There were 7 or 8 women, some named, some not, who came forward with stories about Senator Franken, who said he had treated them very badly. It was a kind of serial creepiness. There was the horrifying photo that he posed for, almost as if to memorialize a certain abuse. So it does not strike me as unreasonable that he stepped down at all. It strikes me as in line with a national attempt to declare, so that we all understand what the rules and ways of being are now.
Cornell, Jonathan Alter said Democrats will come to regret this rush to judgment on Franken. Do you believe that?
I don't. I think we can call people, we can have respect for people, and just like with Conyers, I think Conyers is an icon, but we also have to hold them responsible, right? And I also think that this is an important cultural moment. Like, I'm having conversations with as a guy, I think we should shut up and listen.
Yes.
But I'm having conversations with my young boys right now about this thing in a way that we would not have. Kudos for these courageous women standing up and bringing this to the forefront.
I'm going to make a hard turn here. Sorry, Hallie.
Okay.
I'm going to make a hard turn to the Mueller probe, because I'm curious if you're starting to hear inside the White House what we've been seeing on a certain cable channel in prime time at night. Let me play a montage. Mr. Hannity and Ms. Ingram.
Robert Mueller's entire investigation, we now know tonight, is one giant cesspool. It's full of corruption, partisanship, and unbridled bias. It is the epitome of the Washington, D.C. sewer and swamp.
But with every passing day, we learn more about the shocking anti-Trump bias of Bob Mueller's team.
Also, Judge, it does look like Robert Mueller's team is stacked with people who just hate the president.
You're starting to hear that. Ty Cobb, the president's lawyer, in-house lawyer that sits in the White House, doesn't ever get involved in that kind of commentary, though. Is the president starting to feed off of this a little bit?
You would not, I think, see the president, people who support the president, coming out on television and talking publicly about it if they didn't think that the president wouldn't be angry with them for doing it. And so I think my sense is what you're seeing is the boiling of the frog slowly. This started back when the president talked about this as a witch hunt back in the day, but then the White House very publicly said at the podium that we're at when we asked Sarah Sanders, she said, no, the president is going to continue to allow Bob Mueller to do his job. But I think slowly you're seeing this escalation of real questions being raised about Mueller's credibility with the FBI agent who was let go. That is a major issue. I will also, for people, Republicans, allies of the president, I will also tell you, mood-wise, you can't overstate the paranoia, I think, and the concern inside the West Wing about this investigation, although the president, I'm told, with associates, loves to be talking about his tax bill. He's actually feeling pretty good about where he is right now.
You think the groundwork's being laid here for the president to have at least some support to fire Mueller?
Totally. From their point of view, hey, these Republicans, these establishment Republicans, hey, they swallowed Roy Moore. They swallowed all this other stuff. Why would I think they would not swallow firing of Bob Mueller? Does anybody think that the Republicans are suddenly going to draw the line at that?
Oh, my God, they would.
You do?
Oh, my God. If Mueller were fired, the pushback would be huge. It would be a huge scandal.
And there are people in the West Wing who don't want that to happen, who understand what a political storm that would be.
Can I say part of this pushback you see on Fox and other stations and outlets, part of it is I very much remember Let's Kill Ken Starr in the late 1990s. It was the Democratic Party and Democratic media trying to kill the Republican special prosecutor. That said, it is so important. So much depends on the Mueller investigation that it's not bad, I think, if people look at it in a strict way and just say, make sure everything's on the up and up and fully credible and not partisan political creepiness. Do you know what I mean? They got to be clean or it won't,
they should
in the end, be
They should ask
believed.
the Clinton folks how that attacking the independent counsel thing worked.
Yeah, my
As
God.
unpopular as Ken Starr was,
Exactly.
he did end up getting his articles of impeachment.
He sure did.
Guess what? I'm out of time. I am sorry. That's all we have for today. We'll tell you about what the president watches later, I promise you. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
You can see more Endgame in Postgame, sponsored by Boeing, on the Meet the Press Facebook page.